Gurgles, and Bugman. After my last experience, my parents reminded me of another story from my childhood. When you're 5, your mind lacks the experience to make informed judgments or connect things that aren't obvious. Over the years, the details get fuzzy and forgotten. Speaking with my parents the other day, they cleared the cobwebs, burying this story. I remember now much too clearly the story of Gurgles and Bugman. I just started kindergarten that year. Everyone's a friend when you're 5, so I had no shortage of classmates. But coming from a poor family, I didn't get to see much of them outside of school. My parents spent all their waking hours trying to make ends meet and didn't have time to ferry me from house to house. So I kept my early years mostly keeping to myself, playing with the random assortments of knickknacks from the shelf in my room. Being short of money gave my family a habit of hoarding, so they hated to throw anything out. One particular item on the shelf was a small old-fashioned TV set, a wooden veneer box about 2 feet wide by a foot tall. It had a curved glass screen that took up half the front panel. Beside the screen was a large chrome dial used to switch channels. At the top sat an antenna formed by 2 terribly twisted wires. When my boredom made me turn it on, I'd usually just get static and snow on the glowing black and white screen. I twisted the heavy clicking dial, hoping to pick up some local broadcast. Mostly it would be some ghostly images and incoherent sound fragments, but one channel was always crystal clear. It was the Gurgles and Bugman show. Gurgles was a clown, but not a common one. He wore a thin black suit that draped his tall, skinny body with a matching tie, and an oversized novelty clown shoes to complete his distinctive outfit. His pupils were completely black, light polished ebony marbles with no trace of white around them. Black face paint around those eyes, and across his cheeks and mouth made him look like a manic, grinning skeleton. It was only the crazy crop of curly hair sprouting off the sides of his head that gave him more of a human look. As much as Gurgles freaked me out, Bugman scared me more. He was short and round, like a hunchbacked dwarf, with a dark cape. He had a prosthetic covering his eyes to make him look like a fly, and a mouth that was rotated 90 degrees and opened from side to side. The show itself was like candid camera, with pranks played on unsuspecting people. It would always start with Gurgles and Bugman hidden away at someone's home. Gurgles would face the camera, staring at you, his bony finger touching his lips. When the unsuspecting star of the show came into view, a laugh track would begin to play. You'd see them go about their nightly routines, oblivious to the conspiracy that Gurgles and Bugman had involved us in. We'd see them making dinner, or on the lounge watching TV with their family, or quietly doing their homework. Then watch as Gurgles and Bugman stole their pen, or moved their glass, or made things disappear behind their backs. The camera angles would change as Gurgles and Bugman shifted their hiding places from the dark corners of the room to the cupboards, or to the ceiling, or under the furniture, all the while looking back at you, winking. The closer they got, the louder and more laughter from the soundtrack. Eventually, everyone went to sleep and a victim would be chosen for their prank. Waiting in the closet or under the bed, once their victims fell asleep, Bugman would crawl out and gently climb in beside them. His jaw would open sideways, and out would come a sharp straw that he'd stick in the person's neck. This always paralyzed their victim, because sometimes you could see them struggle if they woke and saw Gurgles and Bugman on top of them. The laugh track would be extra loud and uproarious those few times the victims awoke. Gurgles would make faces at the camera while the audience laughed, and Bugman would use his straw to drink from the person's neck. When the victim stopped struggling after a few minutes, and the laughter would turn to claps and cheering. With Bugman finished, Gurgles' face would fill the whole screen with his impossibly wide, sharp-toothed grin. Then he'd whisper, "See you again soon." The way those all-black eyes pierced through the screen always gave me the chills. I hated the show, but would always be too afraid to go near the TV while it was running. One day, the TV mysteriously disappeared from my room. My parents told my 5-year-old self that they'd sold it to pay some bills. I accepted that without question. I was kinda glad it was gone. But yesterday when I asked them about the TV again, they exchanged nervous glances, then filled in some missing gaps from my childhood. Halfway through that year, Derek, a classmate I didn't know very well, had died in horrific circumstances. He was murdered in his bed with a stab wound to the neck. No evidence of a break-in was ever found, so his distraught parents were taken into custody as the primary suspects. They denied all the allegations against them. At the time, Mrs. Nolan, my teacher, told our class, I'd apparently explained to her that Derek couldn't be dead because I just saw him and his family on the Gurgles and Bugman show the day before. When Mrs. Nolan mentioned it to my parents, what I'd said, they had immediately taken the TV from my room, driven it to a junkyard, and had it burned to nothing but ashes and molten metal. That TV was in my room because it had always been broken. It was never plugged in the whole time. It sat on my shelf. So that's my story of Gurgles and Bugman, but I'm not sure if that's really the end though. After all, do Gurgles and Bugman still perform their nightly shows for some unsuspecting viewer somewhere in this world? And if so, who will be their next star? My name is Jocelyn, and some people say I'm born with a gift, but it feels like a curse. I can see things, mainly people who have passed on from this life that still wander this world, also known as ghosts. Some do not know that they are dead, while others are bound to places or to people for whatever reason. I see them quite frequently, and I try to ignore them. If they know that you can see them, they will bother you, but if you ignore them, they will go away. Despite my gift and all of my experiences, this isn't a ghost story. It's something much, much darker. All of my life, I have learned to cope with my gift, and almost found a way to rid myself of such a burden. I grew up in the city and would see just as many spirits as I would people, which made my developing years very difficult. It wasn't until I was around 7 or 8 until I realized that these spirits weren't actually a part of my physical world. For years, I've been seeing people that specialize in such areas to help reduce my connectivity to the spirit realm and connect to other things, like nature. Nature has an effortless beauty that makes connecting to the world a pure experience. Me and my boyfriend moved into the country to better help get in touch with nature and to limit my connection with spirits that have passed. We moved to southern Idaho, just outside of a small town, about 10 years ago. The town was small, but had just enough of what we needed to live comfortably. During my time there, I maybe saw a handful of spirits that were just passing through, and I was able to lose most of my gift to see spirits. On the plus side to moving to Idaho, my boyfriend's family lives nearby. My boyfriend has 2 brothers, Riley and Caleb, both of which he would consider outdoor people that like their toys and to go camping whenever they could. They were both married to women that had very similar interests as us, making us natural friends, yet I didn't tell them about my gift. One brisk morning, we get a call from my boyfriend's brother, who lived down the street, saying that he wanted to take us out 4-wheeling and go camping over the weekend. I was currently in between jobs, and my boyfriend had a very flexible job that made spontaneous trips like this possible. We would go camping all over, never in the same place twice. It was their family rule to always try something new, in order to live life to the fullest, or something. That's what they said, at least. This was fine, but it did make finding new places to camp somewhat difficult. I guess one of the brothers was able to find a place that looked perfect to ride dirt bikes when he was on a logging site that they ended up having to abandon for unknown reasons. We are given coordinates to this camping site by one of the brothers. It's basically in the middle of nowhere. Riley tells us that he's able to get off work early and that he'll go and set up camp for us. We pack up and drive to where the coordinates take us, and we arrive at this dirt road that leads us into this heavily wooded area. The coordinates that he gave us were very specific. Without them, we would not be able to find this trail, since the Google Maps yielded us no results. I could see why a logging company would be interested in this area. As we drove down this dirt path, I began to feel uneasy, a feeling I haven't felt in some time. I sense as if I'm about to see a spirit, but I don't see anything. It has been many years since I've felt like this, so it catches me off guard. We can't stay here, I tell my boyfriend. I have a bad feeling. He stops driving and seems concerned. Can you see anything? He asks. I look around the area trying to see where this feeling is coming from, but I can only see trees. Well, no, not exactly, I respond. He nods his head and says, well, let's at least give this a try. Maybe the feeling will go away. The deeper we go into the woods, the feeling gets worse. I'm about to say something again, but we finally see Riley and Caleb's campsite. My boyfriend seems excited and pulls into the campsite next to their trucks that are hauling four-wheelers and dirt bikes. Upon arriving to the campsite, I see it. I can see a spirit of what seems to be an old man standing right next to our campsite. I immediately freeze as I'm reminded of my gift. It had been many years since I was able to see a spirit, so I was caught off guard, but I tried to play it off as no big deal. The old man's ghost is greatly disfigured. It looks as if it was mauled by some sort of animal that lived in the woods. I noticed the clothing of the spirit. It was somewhat modern, which told me that the spirit had recently passed away. The spirit of the old man didn't say anything. It just stood there, covered in blood, and put his finger to his lips, as if he wanted me to be quiet. As this happened, I was then greeted by my boyfriend's brothers, Riley and Caleb, as well as their wives. This brief distraction caused me to lose focus on the old man, and when I looked back to where he was standing, he was gone. In the past, when I would see spirits, I would do my best to ignore them. However, I was perplexed as to why the ghost wanted me to be quiet. I felt as if he was trying to warn me. The feeling of darkness seemed to lift ever so slightly, but still hung in the air like the smell of earth after a heavy rain. The sun was beginning to set, so my boyfriend asked me to help get her stuff set up. Hey Jocelyn, a little help with the tent? He said while messing with one of the tent poles. I walked over and debated on telling him what I saw, but I felt like if I did that, it would be ruining the trip for everyone. I swallowed my conflictions and decided that since the spirit of the old man was gone, that he would hopefully stay away. There was no need to worry anyone. Soon after we got the tent up, we walked over to the group who was surrounded by a cozy fire that illuminated a small cove of trees that it was under. The sun had not completely set, but the trees took away what little light it had to offer. In terms of seclusion and beauty, we had certainly found the perfect spot. The area was fairly damp due to a recent rain, which made finding new firewood a bit of a task. Most of the trees nearby were green with life, so finding any dried up branches or fallen logs would require us to venture out of our small bubble of light and safety and into the darkness. Thankfully, Caleb was insightful enough to gather a small bundle of wood prior to us arriving. However, the bundle would not last us all night. The fire burned a bright glow that, combined with the pleasure of the company that surrounded it, melted the feelings of darkness and danger away. I was good friends with Riley and Caleb's wives, so we were able to hit it off rather easily. We hung out around the campfire, having a good time drinking beers, catching up since the last time we saw each other. The boys were busy inspecting the motorbikes that they towed along to make sure that they were ready for tomorrow. After what felt like a while, and perhaps too long, we finally came together to start cooking dinner. Thankfully, we brought a propane stove, but the fire was nearly dead. We assigned Riley to cook our burgers while we all went out to find more firewood. My boyfriend and I ventured off into the dark woods. I had a bright blue LED light that seemed to pierce the thick fog that hung in the air, providing a small cone of artificial light. The ground and the nearby trees were still wet from the rain earlier. This made finding firewood very difficult. We figured that the further we ventured, the higher chance we would find some dry wood. While we hiked, I decided to share what I saw earlier about the spirit of the old man. My boyfriend seemed shocked, since it had been years since I'd seen one. He probably thought that I'd lost the gift at this point. He stopped walking and looked at me. "Jocelyn, are you going to be okay? What do you think the spirit wants?" he asked. I told him I wasn't sure. I left out the part of the spirit telling me to be quiet. I figured it wasn't important. I told him I think I'll be fine, but I got a bad vibe from these woods. A light rain began to fall as I was telling him, and we raced back to the campsite, empty-handed. We were the first to come back, other than Riley, who stayed back to cook. Riley welcomed us back, although he gave us a hard time for not bringing back any wood. The group slowly came back, one by one, with wet wood. Everyone except for Caleb. We didn't notice too much since we were trying to stoke the fire with wet wood. After we got the fire roaring again, we noticed that Caleb hadn't come back. We were about to start eating dinner without him when he finally returned. Caleb was one of those guys that was never afraid of anything, or at least that's what he said. Something definitely spooked him out in the woods, because he could not stop looking over his shoulder, as if something was following him. When Caleb finally got back, we asked him, "Caleb, what took you so long?" You could tell he was conflicted with the answer he was about to give. He hesitated and waited, and then said, "It's nothing." Most of the group disregarded what he said, but I didn't. I felt the same way. I felt uneasy. We finally then had dinner, which was delicious. Riley did a great job on cooking the food. As we had dinner and started talking, the bad feelings seemed to evaporate. Whatever made Caleb feel uneasy out in the woods was clearly not bothering him anymore. A couple of hours passed and we continued to have a good time. I don't know who it was, but someone suggested that we tell the scariest story that we know. Personally, I don't like scary stories since I practically live one every day. Despite me not liking them, I did not object. We decided to go in order, giving each other enough time to think of a scary story. I started and I told some story about a golden arm or something that I heard when I was in girls' camp many years ago. I didn't remember all the details and I think I botched the ending, but nonetheless, everyone seemed to enjoy it. We finally got around to Riley, who told us a scary story about skinwalkers. This instantly made me uneasy, since I believe in them. I believe in them to the point that I won't say their name. I think that it somehow draws them to you. As Riley was telling his story about, well, I could tell that Caleb was looking around camp and over his shoulder. He was feeling uneasy again. Riley finally finished his story, which felt like forever, and everyone was on the edge of their seats. I think the mixture of the story, as well as the environment that we were in, made it extra scary. We finally decided to call it a night around 1 a.m. We wanted to get up early and ride dirt bikes. As we were going to bed, I couldn't help but notice that Caleb was shining his flashlight off into the woods, as if he was looking for someone. The night was difficult for me. I found that every sound out in the woods made me jump and I couldn't quite fall asleep. My sleep was disturbed throughout the night and I woke up exhausted. In the morning we started breakfast as usual. Everyone seemed to be exhausted from the lack of sleep, especially Caleb. I remember at one point Caleb asked, "Did anyone else hear that sound off in the woods last night? It sounded as if someone was screaming." Everyone looked surprised, but no one can confirm that they heard the sound as well. Despite the events and our lack of sleep, we decided to stay and ride our dirt bikes throughout the forest. As I was eating breakfast, I could see the spirit of the old man again. He continued to put his finger to his lips, as if he wanted me to be quiet still. But this time, he did something different. He finally spoke to me and said, "It knows you're here." The spirit then disappeared. I sat in complete awe of what just happened. What was the spirit trying to warn me of? I finally come back to reality, and I see that everyone is starting to put on their riding gear. Normally, I'm all for riding, but considering the circumstances, I do not want to leave the camp. Thankfully, one of the brothers' wives was a couple months pregnant, so it was the perfect excuse for me to stay back and keep her company. The group decides that they'll ride for a couple of hours, and then meet back up at noon for lunch. I stay back at camp and just keep an eye on the fire, as well as talking with one of the wives. Noon eventually rolls around, and everyone but Riley shows up for lunch. Knowing Riley, this was his typical behavior. He was a bit of a wild card. I ask if we should wait for him before we have lunch, but my boyfriend tells me that he probably found this awesome trail and that he's not hungry anyways. The group then eats lunch and leaves before Riley can return. No one seems to be worried about Riley, other than me. Later in the day, as I'm sitting back at camp, I finally see Riley, but he's not riding his dirt bike. He's walking. I notice that his clothes are bloodied and tattered. Riley seems to be walking fine, but I notice that something is off about Riley. That bad feeling I felt earlier comes back 10 times worse. Naturally, I'm concerned about Riley's condition since he seems bloodied. But before I can say anything to him, the old man's spirit appears next to Riley, and Riley can see him. Riley doesn't say anything. He just stares at the old man and looks back at me. He puts his finger up to his lips and goes, "Shh," before both of them disappear. It finally dawned on me what has happened. Something killed Riley in these woods, and he came back to warn me. The wife that stayed back that was pregnant was taking a nap, so I didn't want to bother her, and everyone else was out riding. The hours dragged on as I waited back at camp alone. I made sure to keep the fire going, and I collected enough wood to last us many nights. The group finally returned after what felt like a lifetime. I ran out to greet them and was going to tell my boyfriend what I saw, but to my surprise, I saw Riley being assisted by my boyfriend as Riley struggled to walk normally. I immediately screamed to my boyfriend that he wasn't with Riley, but with something else. Naturally, my boyfriend was confused and stopped walking. He started walking towards me and asked, "What did you say?" Riley was now on the ground and he was convulsing. I ran up to my boyfriend and I whispered loudly in his ear, "I saw Riley's spirit. He's dead. I don't know what that is. That isn't Riley." My boyfriend took a step back and asked me, "Jocelyn, have you been drinking today?" Before I could give an answer, the thing that was impersonating Riley started to shapeshift and let out a loud scream. The group began to immediately panic as they saw the horrors unfold in front of them. The creature began to look less like Riley and more like an emaciated werewolf. Caleb was thankfully right next to his truck and was able to go inside and pull out his shotgun. He let out 3 shots, but unfortunately were not effective at that range. The creature, for some reason, was particularly drawn to me and started to charge at me. At this time, Caleb was able to close the gap and was much closer. He let out 2 more shots, one of which hitting solid. A good chunk of flesh blew off the creature, and it was enough to scare it off into the woods. We were all left there in silence. We were completely stunned as to what just happened. Something was able to kill Riley, and even worse, was to take his form. Had his spirit not come back to me and tried to talk to me, I probably would not have noticed the difference. We obviously got out of there in record time. We called the police and told them what had happened. At first, the authorities thought that we were either on drugs or drinking. Granted, our story was rather out there, but nonetheless, it was the truth. The authorities finally believed us, at least enough to send out a search party, but we never did find Riley's body. We did find his new dirt bike, although it was mangled up pretty badly. As long as this story is, this unfortunately is not the end. Looking back, my boyfriend and I both think that, since he told us that story about skinwalkers, that he was targeted by one. We have made a promise to each other not to say the name. Life as we know it has never been the same after. We have missed Riley dearly, and I've started to have these really awful nightmares about that creature. My sleep pattern has gotten worse, and I've been told by my boyfriend that I start to sleep talk. The dreams have gotten so severe at certain points that I have woken myself up from screaming. Unfortunately, one night I was jolted awake by my boyfriend who was shaking me. He woke me up and said, Jocelyn, do you know what you just said?" I tried my best to wake up, but I was still dazed and confused. "Jocelyn, you just said the word. You just said Skinwalker." I could feel a heavy weight in my stomach as I realized what had just happened. I'd accidentally said Skinwalker in my sleep. Now only time will tell what will happen to me. It was a nice day. Fresh, light, warm. A most harmless of days. Until I heard my mother scream so loud, it would have woken the devil. I found her standing in the garden in hysterics, pacing back and forth, looking in bushes and over fences. I grabbed her and tried to speak, but she just kept screaming. I gave her a slap and it actually worked. "What happened? What's wrong?" My mother's pale face replied, "Your sister, she's gone. I was just watching her play with the flowers, but when I blinked, a man was standing behind her. I blinked again, and she had vanished." The empty black hole feeling filled my stomach. It was impossible what she just described, but the look on her face and the shaking of her hands told the truth. Was there enough time to see what he looked like? She looked like she was going to throw up. I did, but you nor anyone would believe me. I know you're not mad. She's gone and you saw who took her. I will believe you, please. She grabbed my hand with hers and held tightly. He was very tall. So tall. He was looming over her. His hands were thin and long like twigs. He himself was thin, skeletal almost. But he wore a suit. A well-fitted black suit with a black tie. She burst into tears and buried her head into my shoulders. "It's okay, we'll find her. Did you see his face? Any strong features which would make him stand out?" I carried on holding her, feeling the tears soak through my jumper and shirt. She began to whisper something which I couldn't make out. "I'll believe you no matter what. What did his face look like?" She pulled back and looked right into my eyes. He had no face. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. It was blank. Pure. White. She began to cry again. I felt terrified. An unknown person with no face had just taken my little sister, her daughter. I brought my mother into the house and sat her down. I told her that I will call the police. I will deal with this. 911, what's your emergency? My little sister, she'd just been kidnapped. Please send the police over. He still might be walking around with her. We have a description of the man. Okay, what's your address and please give the description of the man. I gave my address and began to explain. He is tall, extremely tall, and deathly thin but in a black suit. And he is white. Not in race, but in pure white. And he has no face. I know it sounds insane, but this is what we'd seen, please. The man on the other end went silent. I thought I'd been cut off. We'll send someone out. They'll be there in about 5 minutes. And he hung up. 1 hour had went by. No one had turned up. My mother's friend had come around and was comforting her, but no police or investigators. This is effing stupid. I refuse to sit here. I'm going down to the police station myself. I can't sit by while she's out there. I ran out of the house, down the busy street, and all the way to the police station. The lady at the front desk gave me a funny look as I ran in panting. "Are you alright, miss?" "No, my little sister was taken, and I called 911, and no one came. I called an hour ago. Where have you been?" She looked shocked. "We've had no calls about a kidnapping in the past hour, or day." I now felt sick. "I will call one of our guys in, and you can talk to him." A brief moment later, I was in the room with 2 officers, answering questions about my sister, where I live, what my mother was doing, and what I was doing. I then gave the description once again, and once again I got a blank look with no voices. The idea of this man who took my sister was becoming more and more insane. "He had no face?" "No face, I'd already told you. Tall, thin, black suit, white, faceless face. I'm not sure why I need to repeat myself. Can we go out and find him?" They gave each other a horrified look. "No, we can't. I'm sorry. We nor anyone can help you or your sister. Just hope he doesn't come back. I'd move if I was you. Now leave." Leave? A young child was kidnapped, and I had been told to get on with it. "No, I won't leave. You'll help me find her. What are you scared of?" Imagine how scared she is. She must be terrified. "How will you be able to sleep knowing you won't help me? I can't do this alone, but I will if I must. If you're too much of a sissy." I got swiftly thrown out. I had only a description of this man and no help. The best I thought was to perhaps Google this, so I began to walk home. I only got down the street from the police station when a police car pulled up next to me. It was one of the officers I had just spoken to, no doubt asking for forgiveness so he could sleep happy tonight. "I'm so sorry. If you get in the car, I'll explain more. I'll tell you what you need to know." I had no choice. I needed help, and here it was. I got in the car and he began to drive. You're not the first to describe this man. Children, adults, elderly have been taken by this man. There's no certain target for him. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, black or white, female or male, sane or insane. As long as you're alive, you're at risk. We have tried countless times to hunt him down, and anytime anyone gets close, they start going insane. Come to work sleepless and say that they saw him in their sleep, in their house, garden, even when they go food shopping. They either kill themselves or vanish. This is why we can't help anyone. If you start getting involved, he'll come after you. It'll start off small. Maybe you'll notice him in a crowd, but think nothing of it. And then it grows. We can't keep giving our good men and women to him. We would have no police left. I am warning you. If you try finding him, and your sister, he will get to you. He will change you. I know she's important, but your mother doesn't want 2 of her daughters gone. I was stunned and lost. If I try to find her, there's a big chance that I will go too, and leave my mother, but if you guys can't find him or stop him, maybe I can, and I will. My self-preservation is not important anymore. People are vanishing because of this man, and everyone has become selfish in keeping away. He knows he can do it. If I go insane but stop him, imagine how many people that can save and their loving families. The children who can experience life. This is not about my life or soul. I thank you for the warning, but it's not just about my sister, but everyone now. I'm afraid, but so were all the others. I will stop him. My heart was racing so fast I thought it was going to crack its way out of my chest. I gave the officer a strong look into his eyes through the rearview mirror. He sighed loudly and stopped outside my house. It's noble what you're doing, but don't act stupid or act like a hero, because this is no time or place for a hero. Here. He pulled out from under the car seat a gun. You might need this. God knows if a gun can actually hurt him. I froze up from that quote. A gun? Might not hurt him? What am I dealing with? Then everything he had said, the description sunk in like a bullet. No face, A no-faced man? Sorry, it just sunk in. Thanks. I will see if it does hurt him, or at least scare him off. He pointed to a little switch on the gun and flicked it. I presumed that this was the safety. I hid the gun in my trousers and got out of the car. You won't hear from me again. I can't get involved. Try not to go mad. And with that, he drove off. I felt empty inside, not knowing what to do now. I had no leads. I looked down at the ground and sighed, thinking of anything I could do, and the best thing I could think of was Google. I looked it up. This was my first sighting of him. He was across the road standing behind a car which had been washed. My head throbbed as I looked at him. I looked away and rubbed my eyes till I saw the multicolored stars. When my vision came back, he was gone. I knew the timer of my sanity had begun. For a couple of months, I spent time researching this man, putting up questions on local forums, finding pictures, anything, any scraps. I would see him whenever I would leave the house, and sometimes in my dreams, but it was manageable. My life was not being destroyed by him, yet. My mother was in therapy over my sister. It seemed to help, but every couple of days she would come in my room and give me a long hug. I couldn't imagine how tough this was for her. I never told her what I was doing. I didn't want him to come for her as well. As long as he was focused on me, I could work. Many forum replies said, "Stop. You're a monster for trying to get us involved. Leave the demon alone." However, I got one reply from a new user. He sent me an inbox message. "I know the man you're searching for. He took my father 5 years ago. I saw him once and never again. I have spent the years finding out what I can. He has appeared throughout history. There are many paintings showing him and poems talking about a faceless man. He hasn't always been in this area. He seemed to move from place to place, and even to different countries. Forests seem to be the #1 place he looms, but as the world progresses and the forests vanish, he's having to come out into the urban environment. Even his clothes change with the times, even though they give him no disguise. The only relation his targets have is that they're both human and alive. Not everyone he stalks is taken, but nearly all the stories you've heard of ghosts and ghouls will be related to him driving people mad. Staring at him causes intense headaches, but I have no clue as to why. There have been reports of people cutting holes into their heads to release the pressure caused by these headaches. People refusing to sleep. People refusing to wake. I have never read about a madness like this. Yet, it seems all he does is appear. There is no talking with him, or action. He just stands there, staring at you with no eyes. My father was a well-built man, not someone who could be taken down easily. Yet he vanished before my very eyes, while clutching his head and eyes. I couldn't run after him because the pain of looking stopped me in my tracks. You're dealing with something which is ungodly and unworldly. He will never be scared of you. As you draw closer, he will become more frightening. The best advice I can give is to not look at him for too long, to stay away from the local woods. Stay at home. Wait for him to leave you alone, because he will if you leave him alone. Your sister is gone. No one knows where the people are taken to. I can tell you a symbol which appears constantly around him. It's a circle with an X through it. If you are certain you want to hunt him, then search for that. I can't tell you any more. My searching has left me in a state and I'm being taken away tomorrow. I pray for your safety. The more I delved in, the more scared and confused I became. But now I had something. The local forest and a symbol. It's enough to start this. I kept dreaming of my little sister playing happily, and it happened every night. I saved the message and I reread it a few times. I didn't reply to it. There was no point saying I hope you get better. It was far too late. But perhaps where he was going is some form of safety. I had my start. That night, the faceless man appeared in my sleep. He was just standing at the end of a long hallway, not moving. He just looked at me. I awoke to an uneasy feeling, but I was able to function, yet I knew this would not last. I waited a few days before I would investigate the woods so I could calm my head somewhat. It was half an hour's walk to the forest. I brought food, water, my phone with a map, as well as a pen and paper. I was good at sketching what I see fast, and I prefer it to a photo. It was midday when I entered the woods. The only thing I knew I was searching for was that symbol. I kept an eye open for it on the trees, the ground, or even a fence. I kept checking my phone to see how far in I was. For an hour I searched for anything, and came across nothing. If anything, it was just a pleasant walk in the forest. A calm, cool breeze blew across my face, taking the sun's hot rays away from me. Thinking this was enough for today, I chose to head back. It was enough searching for now. I was following the route my phone had made back when it started to flicker and buzz, changing the path. At one point it flashed that symbol I was looking for. I was starting to panic badly. I was aware of the empty woods around me, but they now felt filled with evil eyes. I wanted to claw my eyes into the back of my head. My head began to hurt. I looked around for him, as this was a sure sign, but I couldn't see him anywhere. I walked a bit further away, guessing my way back, but the headache was more focused, and my phone more broken. I heard rustling from far away. I froze. I stared with my gaping eyes, waiting to be pounced on by him. To simply blink with my eyes and he be there, over me. The seconds stood still in a hell-torturous way. I couldn't breathe. A final rustle, and a dog ran out, straight towards me, jumping up and licking my face. I almost passed out from the relief. I looked at my phone and the map was back working fine, along with my head. My head felt like a window that had been opened, letting out all the hot air. A couple ran over saying sorry for their dog. I told them not to worry. It was a thankful surprise. I stumbled home and threw myself on my bed. I had very little energy, but I understood the madness now, which comes from this man. What it does. What it feels like. I underestimated it. I drifted off into a deep sleep. My dream this night was different. I was in the woods at night with nothing on me. The moon was bright enough to light the whole forest in a dim blue light. There was no breeze, no resulting of cold air. The forest was dead, silent. I tried walking forward, but I couldn't. My feet had roots wrapped around them. The more I pulled, the tighter and deeper they sunk into the ground. I looked up and he was right there, in front of me. My eyes met with his chest. I avoided his face, forcing my head to look down. He didn't move. He just stood in front of me like a statue. I could feel his lost eyes bearing down into my skull. It wasn't physically painful, but knowing that he was doing it that is what was hurting. It was teasing, abusive, but I kept looking down. I imagined there was a weight hanging from my chin, pulling my whole head down. I kept imagining it, but as I did, I could feel the weight on the back of my head, pulling it back. I focused on my weight, not the one he was putting on me. The harder I tried, the harder he tried. It became too much and my head swung up and I looked at him. I screamed from the pain. I awoke, but my eyes wouldn't open. They were forced shut. They were screwed up tight, like when you were a child and saw something terrible. After a while, my eyes loosened, but I did not in any sense feel safe. I barely opened my eyes and there he was, in my room. Not in the corner, but once again, over me. I could feel his hand on my head. I wanted to die and scream while doing it. I closed my eyes and the feeling on my head went away. My safe feeling came back and I knew he was gone. I opened my eyes fully and put the light on. It was 6 a.m. A cold dinner was on my desk. My eyes cried as if I'd stared into the sun. I clambered to my mirror and looked. My eyes were red completely. All the little blood vessels had blown. I could barely look as the light hurt. My eyes had to stay closed, so I felt my way around to my mother's room. I heard my mother on the way. "Dear, what happened? Are you okay?" "My eyes, Mom. Gah, my eyes. The blood vessels, they've all bursted. We need to get to the hospital." I opened my eyes slightly to look at her. She grabbed my arm and threw her warm coat over my head. "What on earth did you do? Look into the sun? Into a laser pen? You're dang lucky you're not blind." The doctor was not impressed, and when I said I woke up like it, he would not believe me. "Maybe you're drunk a lot and hurt yourself. I don't know, but the pain should go away by the end of the day. Your eyes are dry, which is why they hurt. Just keep them closed and enjoy the radio." He sounded like a jerk, but I did as he said. I was also prescribed some eye drops. I spent the day helpless, but not thinking about him. I was more scared about my red eyes. A couple of days later, I began recalling what happened and how I felt. The pure fear and loss of control. How he did nothing in my dream but look. Did he know that's all he needed? Was this a matter of wits? The control and power of a mind to appear in my room and in my dream seemed extreme compared to before, where he would be in the distance, barely visible. Perhaps I was close to something in the woods, which I couldn't see. My gut was telling me that this was true. I was close and he acted extremely to keep me away. But why keep me away? Surely he would want me to find whatever it was. Catch me. I realized that I had to go back. I had saved the route on the way back last time. I reached over to my eye drops as they began to sting. I read on the box, "Please read instructions." I had never seen "please" on the label before. Pulling out the little fold-up instructions, I saw that these were instructions. We didn't need them. He already told me how to use them. I opened it up and flattened it out a bit. Typed out on it was, "I have seen this a few times before. For all that is holy, keep away from the suited man. I don't want another cover-up. I can't take it anymore." This would explain why he was so hard on me. I screwed it up and threw it into the bin. I was already cursed and targeted by him. Stopping would not cure me, so I might as well keep going. I could see in the corner of my eye, him, standing at my window. I walked over but was looking away. I drew the curtains. I felt angry at what this thing had done, and I certainly wasn't going to give up yet. He was going to get harsher and more torturous to me, but I would get tougher. As I reminded myself when I felt crazy and depressed from this, it's not just for my sister, it's for everyone. A week later, I was back in the forest. He had been in every dream that week, staring at me, and I was tired from it, but I still came out. I was back at the location where he began to attack me last time. Nothing was happening. I was here at the same time with the same items. I must have been wrong. I wasn't close. But I wasn't going to let that dishearten me. I found something. I came close to something and I made him freak. So I pushed on. If I felt a headache, I knew I was getting closer than before. I felt more anger and determination, pushing forward and deeper into the forest. I was losing track of myself. I could only see finding what it was. I was hypnotized until, on the trees beside me, I saw the symbol. I almost walked straight by it. There carved in the tree was a circle with an X through it. I felt it with my hands. It seemed unreal almost. It was a rough carving, done quickly by the look of it. I carried on, guessing I was on the right track. I tried not to get too focused this time. I kept my mind open so I could see any more symbols, and I did. They became more frequent, almost on every tree until it was on every tree. I was surrounded by this symbol, carved at different heights and sizes. There was just a small area where no tree stood. I was in the middle and looked all around. I couldn't believe this sight.
Hundreds of these symbols, all focused in this area. I began to look around me. There must be something here, I said to myself, barely recognizing the headache which was forming. I was rubbing my hand on the ground when I whacked it on something. I moved what plants I could out of the way and saw a small handle. I went to grab it when my phone began to vibrate violently, and my head screamed. I had forgotten about being careful. I looked up, and before I could register seeing him, I was flung back and knocked out. The cold wind biting my nose and hands woke me. It was dark now, and I was alarmed. My phone was dead, and I wasn't sure of the way back. All of the symbols on the trees had gone. He was screwing with me, and doing it well. I fumbled on the ground, making sure the handle was real. Upon finding it, I found a few stones and placed them all around the handle, so I could find it another day. Then I ran back as I guesstimated my way home. I had no light, so trying to be as careful as I could afford to not trip over anything. But rocks and roots were the least of my problems. My head would randomly pound. It felt like my skull was being punched. I couldn't see him, but you didn't need to. I kept going best I could, but the urge to look behind me was growing stronger. I gave a quick glance behind, and he was right behind me. I yelled from the pain in my head, but I kept looking back. I didn't know what to do. I looked back again, but as I ran, a tree got in front of him. The pain lightened, and I didn't want to look back. So, I kept him behind the tree for as long as I could. I would look forward and he would be there again, but I would do the same thing as before and get a blasted tree in front of him. A fair few times I did this till I tripped up. I landed flat on my face. I had lost my lead and my pattern to keep him away. I went to get up when I was lifted up. I squeezed my eyes shut. I knew he was lifting me up, yet my eyes began to open, and they opened to horror. It wasn't his arms lifting me, but tentacles. 8 of them, each limb being held apart, and my eyes locked his lost eyes. I could feel anger from him. It was in the air. I'd gotten too close. How do I get out? How do you get away from something which has no fear, which knows he can get away with anything? Fear was his friend, if not himself. My mind turned into a blur as I kept trying to catch ideas. He was in my head, and pulling my limbs further apart, muscles pulling. It was more than desperate now. I grabbed one thought, pushed myself and used the only part of my body which wasn't being held, my head, and I headbutted him. It was the worst pain I'd ever experienced upon impact, yet I knew it wasn't the impact which hurt, but touching him which did it. But it worked. I was dropped. I didn't think he was expecting it. I almost threw up from the pain, but knew I had just bought some time. I got back up and limped through the forest. I looked back and he was far back, which a small smear of blood on his forehead was from me. I had actually done something which shocked a being which had no feelings. I felt a small sense of achievement. I got you now, you jerk. I got you, I said to myself, knowing that I could do this and not get killed from it. I leaned in and pushed myself off the trees to get me off to the edge of the forest. I could see some lights from a car park. I wasn't sure where I'd end up, but anywhere was better than in here. I gave a last look back, but I couldn't see him. I threw myself into the tall car park lights and took in the deepest of breaths. I felt like I'd just come up with air after swimming from the bottom of the sea. There was a single car in the car park. I was going to knock, but I fell to my knees. I let out a quick scream and the fogged-up car doors opened, with a couple running out while putting clothes on. I quickly said sorry for ruining your time before, blacking out. Love, you're waking, yes! How are you feeling? The room was dimly lit. I was laying in my mother's bed with many pillows and blankets covering me. I feel like someone messed me up good. Excuse me? Sorry, so I'm guessing you know that I was found in a car park by the woods? Yes. The couple used your phone and called me, saying that they'd meet us at the hospital. But, well, The doctor wouldn't treat you. Said you brought this on yourself and it wasn't going to get involved. And the police brought you home. The couple stayed here a bit, even invited us to their wedding. The hospital gave us some supplies to fix you up with. Why would they treat you? What have you done? I can't tell you. Otherwise you'd get involved and I dare not get you involved. I'll just rest for now, okay? Okay, dear. But you know that you've been acting funny. It's not the going for more walks, it's how you're not eating, and I catch you talking to yourself. And you close all the curtains and blinds like something's looking in. You're not a bit mad, are you? Have you been doing drugs? No, Mother, and I'm sorry that I've been acting odd. I didn't even know I've been acting that way. I don't remember talking to myself, I just need rest. I think after the kidnapping, it just got to me. She gave me a deep, loving hug. I know, it's gotten to me too. We have to stay strong. Here, have a drink and go back to sleep. You'll be back up in no time. I kept getting night terrors. The situation in the woods kept repeating, each time making me feel worse. I would wake up to feeling sick and sometimes wetting the bed. I explained to my mother that it's the bump that I've got in my head causing the problems. It took a month to recover, but I would see him in the house, sometimes standing behind my mother, in the bath, as I was using the restroom, in my wardrobe when I opened it. Everywhere. He was not letting up one bit. I was exhausted from all of this. I was falling apart and losing myself. I was unsure if I wanted to go on, but I kept going on in my sister's room, which was being packed away slowly, and seeing her little face playing with the toys, and that would hurt more than anything. I would die trying to find at least something. I had to go back, one last time, and fight through everything he could give me. I packed my bag like before, and brought my phone even though there's a fair chance it would cut out when I got close. In my trousers was my gun the officer gave me. It might be useless, but I might also scare him. My door opened slowly and he was standing there. I stared right back at him, knowing that I might not be coming back from this, but I had no fear of death. He vanished before my eyes. I walked through my door and he was at the end of the hallway. I got close and he was then down the stairs. He was leading me back to the forest. He knew this would be a fight. I wasn't scared of following him though. My stomach gave a different story. I followed him to the woods where he vanished. I could hear my heart beating now. I turned to my phone and began to follow the path. I kept looking at my phone. It took me straight to where the trees with the symbols were. This time every tree was completely covered by the symbols. I shined my phone on the damp ground looking for the rocks I left. Nothing had been moved. I grabbed the handle trying to pull. It refused to pull up. I gave it a wiggle and the hatch slid open. I was staring into a dark hole. Every single fiber in me began to riot and protest about going down. I cried a little. I was scared. As I sobbed, I heard a little voice in the darkness, just faintly. I stopped sobbing to make sure it wasn't an echo. I couldn't make out what the sound was. It was just small and light. It was enough to bring me in. I reached the bottom of the ladder. It was dry and warm down here. I shined my phone in front of me only to see a hallway. It was slightly mucky down here with what looked like dried blood. It wasn't everywhere, but it was noticeable. I walked down the hallway trying to be as quiet as possible. I heard a little moan in the distance. It could have been him for all I know. I trusted nothing right now. A few steps more and a couple of lights flickered on. Some were white and some turned things red from blood on them. At the end of the hallway was a large room. It was split into different sections by sheets of metal. I heard them whimper a bit louder this time. I stepped into the large room. It stank and felt damp. My shoes made a light click noise. Is there anyone there? My goodness, the voice. It was her voice. The voice of all love and joy in the world to me. My sister. I thanked as many gods as I could think of for this and almost cried. Haley, yes, it's me, I'm here. Help me. She began to cry lightly. I followed the sound down on one of the splinterings to her. She was on the ground in the corner, barely keeping herself up, but her limbs looked pulled and lifeless. I grabbed her face with my hands. She was ice cold. I looked into her eyes, thanking the gods once more that she had them. He kept trying to pull me, to look thin like him, I think. I hurt. I want Mom. I want to go back home. Please, take me home. I held her tight. I looked back into her eyes and smiled. She should have been dead. Knowing what powers he had, though, he could no doubt keep people alive as long as he needed. I went to pick her up when she screamed. I turned around and he slammed into the far wall. He was very tall now, and his tentacles were flailing. I actually saw him walk through my haze. I pulled my gun out of my trousers and shot at him. He vanished. Haley was crying and I hobbled over to her. "It's gonna be okay. I'm gonna get you out." I picked her up and began to run away. I heard the moans of other people, even saw arms with distorted hands reach from the darkness. He appeared in front of us in the hallway when I shot again. I threw Haley over my shoulders and tied the ropes from my backpack around her waist and began to climb. The gun won't hurt him. I've seen others try. Here, this might work. As I climbed, Haley pulled a sharpened bone from under her top. "Hold on to it till we're at the top. You're sure it'll work?" "No, but I have a gut feeling it will. It is what I've been doing when he's been gone. I'm not sure what's special about it." "If you say it's special and your gut tells you it'll work, then I'll use it." I kept climbing. It was a lot longer up than down. I trusted my sister's judgment with this weapon. The person whose bone this was could have had a special illness, or maybe it was the fact that it was a bone from someone he had killed. I wasn't sure of much. I was rushing too much to think. The hatch was still open. I put Haley on the floor and made sure she was okay. She handed me the sharpened bone, which looked like a femur, and an elongated one at that. As I grabbed it, my hair was pulled back down the hatch. I didn't hit the floor hard. The hallway looked miles longer than before with barely any lights. At the end was the suited man in all his power. My head pounded and my body screamed of 1,000 tortures. I could barely stand up. He flashed forward, again and again, coming closer and closer. I fell to one knee from the pain. My nerves were splitting. I thought I was dying. Again and again he flashed forward down the impossibly long hallway. He was getting terribly close, and I could focus on the weapon in my hand, ready to hurt him when he was close enough. He shot right in front of me. Time slowed completely down. He was reaching out to grab me. I was standing up, moving the bone to strike. He saw with his lost eyes the weapon I held and began to turn away. I shoved it through his ribcage and out through the other shoulder. I screamed at him as I did it, letting all the pain fly out. I gave it a deep, long twist. If he had a mouth, I know he would be using it to scream. I held it there for a while till I pulled it out at an angle, grabbed his suit, pulled his chest towards me again, and shoved it in, again. He gave me one last look and I gave him one last scream. He touched my face before becoming limp. I stood there, holding his body on the bone. I tore it out of him. There was no blood on the bone. I looked down at him. He was disappearing into nothingness before my eyes. I had killed him. The impossible man. I called up to Haley, making sure she was okay. I climbed up and gave her my phone, telling her to call the police, saying that we found some kidnapped people, but not to mention the faceless man. The police took us to the hospital. I was right in the fact that all my sister's limbs were dislocated. Some of the other people down there died when they were moved, or as soon as they got to the hospital. It seemed his magic wasn't keeping them alive anymore. Some, however, did survive. The quick treatment kept them going, and life returned to them. The police officer who gave me the gun came to my sister's room. He stood at the door in amazement. I walked over to him and gave him the gun back. It scared him enough. Thanks. He grabbed me and began to cry. "You saved the love of my life. He was taken 6 months ago, and I never told him that I loved him. And I was killing myself every day knowing I couldn't go after him. And here he is. You saved him. I can't thank you enough. I began to cry with him. Go and see him. Tell him. And stay with him. The officer pulled away from me, nodded, and walked into one of the other doors. A couple of weeks passed. Everyone was doing well in recovery. My mother had calmed down enough that she didn't give my sister 200 kisses and hugs when she saw her. The officer told me how thankful he was again, and that he was now in a relationship with the man I helped rescue. It all seemed sweet, but I didn't feel any better. I felt worse. Worse than before. I dreamt of nothing but blackness, and I had barely any thoughts. Haley would mention how I would just stare at her with no expression or life in me. I wasn't sure what was wrong. It wasn't stress. I wasn't sure until a night where I stayed at the hospital with my sister. I woke from a black dream and stood, but I stood tall. A few feet taller than my real height. I would hold out my arms to see that they were long and thin. My skin was pale and my clothes were tiny on me. I sat back down and got up again, and I was fine. The worst sickening feeling filled me, and I ran to the bathroom and threw up. It looked like blood, but I didn't feel any pain. I washed my face and looked into the mirror. I just looked ill. Something unknown was happening to me. It kept happening. A couple more weeks passed. The situation became dire when I sat in the hospital room with my sister, mother, and nurse. I was looking out the window at the sunshine. My name was called, and when I turned around, they all screamed. They just looked at me in horror. Where did your face go? My throat tightened up. It's back now, but it vanished. What's happening? You look like the man who took... What have you done? I ran down the hall to where the officer's boyfriend was. They were both in there. Can I please talk to you? Now. He came rushing out. Sheesh, you don't look so good. What's wrong? I'm turning into him. What? Yes, you heard it. My face had just disappeared in front of my mother, my sister, and the nurse. Sometimes when I stand up, I stand at least 7 feet. You gotta help me. Throw me in jail, in confinement forever, please. He looked down at his feet, shaking his head, rubbing his eyes. Okay. I know what we can do. When we kept getting reports of kidnappings from the Faceless Man, a company, an organization contacted us. Said if we ever captured him or something of his, we were to contact them. Secure, Contain, and Protect. SCP they are called. They deal in all strange things like this. I'll call them. Just wait with your family. He gave me a pitied look, which I deserved. I walked back to my sister and mother. I looked at them in shame for what was happening. My mother came over and hugged me. My sister, who now walked, hugged me too. We held each other for an endless time. A couple hours passed when the officers walked in with a few large men in suits and a man in a lab suit. The lab suit read SCP, to Secure, Contain, and Protect. My ride was here. I explained everything to them, everything which happened while he took notes. Then he just looked at me with a broken look. It's time for you to come with us. For yours, but mostly everyone else's safety. Say goodbye to everyone. You won't need anything. We will arrange it all. I turned to my family. I had worked hard and pushed far to get Haley back, and I got her, and more. Mother was more than happy that she was home. Haley started to sob. I held her hand. I know this is going to suck, and it's not okay, but I have to go. Be angry at me if you must, but please, don't let this stop you from living your life. I told myself I'd do anything to get you back, and this is what had happened. Cry for a while, but not forever. You can have everything in my room, even the things I told you not to play with. You can have those. But I don't want you to go. I don't want to either, but I have to. You saw what was going on. You saw what was wrong with me. I don't want to hurt anyone. You'll grow up to be a wonderful woman. When you're older, maybe you're right about what had happened. I'll always love you. I grabbed her and kissed her forehead tightly. She nodded as I kissed her, understanding what was happening. I turned to my mother. She only had small tears rolling down her cheeks. She gave me a light hug. "You don't need to explain any of it. You need to go. I understand. I'll always remember you for who you really are. You'll always be alive to me. Be safe." I replied saying that I loved her and walked over to the SCP men and left. It's been 1 year since it all happened. It's nice here. I have my own room for now. I go to therapists to help me through this and anything I ask for. I help out on maintaining computers and even cleaning out other SCP cages, as they won't attack me. The changes are becoming stronger though. I've been seen fully changed, standing in the hallway with no face, tall and thin. They're getting my containment ready for when I change and don't come back. I enjoy myself while I still can. It's hard knowing what you're turning into. I've been told this is fascinating. It explains how the Faceless man has lasted so many centuries. I'm just next in queue. But they have given me a nickname which I think it fits. Slender. They call me Slender.
Typically, when you go through something so traumatic and horrifying, your mind has a way to block those events to keep you from further suffering. However, I remember the events as if it was yesterday. It was a brisk October day with orange and brown leaves littering the streets and sidewalks. The temperature was a perfect chill to where you could almost see your breath. I would be going on a scout trip with my troop and some friends from school who weren't scouts but still wanted to come on the trip despite making fun of me for being in the Boy Scouts. The trip was a 10-mile hike round trip, 2 nights and 3 days. This took place back in the early 90s before the internet was on everyone's cell phone and technology took over our lives. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy the modern conveniences that technology provides, but it also took away some personal feeling from the world. Mr. Dawson was our scoutmaster. He was an old man that looked jolly but was anything but. He wore suspenders since most belts were not able to accommodate his spare tire. He had a grizzly white beard that had streaks of gray in it, and almost always wore an Indiana Jones-styled hat. He was a tough man and rather strong for both his age and appearance. Despite him being an old miser to just about anyone, he did love scouting and raising boys and turning them into men. Alongside Mr. Dawson, we had an assistant scoutmaster who was more understanding when it came to the youth. Mr. Carlson was a younger man in his late 30s who wore big old glasses and always tucked his shirt in, no matter what type of pants he was wearing. I think Mr. Carlson was an accountant of some kind, but he was always a party. We all loved him. Thankfully, having both leaders made our troop very well-rounded, with both growing experiences and also fun ones. Mr. Dawson was retired and divorced. I think he had 1 or maybe 2 children, but he never spoke of them. As unfortunate as that was, he almost always came on all the scout trips, while Mr. Carlson could only come on some of them. Mr. Carlson and his wife were members of my church, and they recently had a child. This would require Mr. Carlson to sometimes stay back and help with the baby. On this trip, however, Mr. Carlson would miss the first night, but hike up on the second day and meet up with us. Apparently, Mr. Dawson had an old friend that had a cabin somewhere, and he allowed the troop to stay there for a couple of nights. The troop, as well as myself and my school friends, were very excited. We have never been on a hike this long before. Normally, if we were lucky and none of the parents volunteered to come, Mr. Dawson would let us shoot his 9mm pistol that he would carry on his suspenders while camping. He also carried a double-barrel shotgun in the back window of his truck, but he never let us shoot it. We all met at the parking lot after school, down at the local grocery store where Mr. Dawson's old green truck sat idling. He sat inside smoking cigarettes. He was a smoker but never smoked near us. The troop trickled in over the next 15 minutes, including Mr. Carlson and his old Honda minivan. He only came for this night since we needed the extra seats to drive all the scouts up to the campgrounds. Once all the scouts arrived, we loaded all of our bags into Mr. Dawson's truck bed and divided the scouts into both vehicles. My friends and I preferred riding with Mr. Carlson. The younger scouts, as well as some of the outcasts, were subjected to Mr. Dawson's truck, where he only listened to political talk radio and talked about old war stories that were not very interesting. We caravanned both vehicles loaded to the brim with both scouts and materials to the local campgrounds on the outskirts of town. We were kind of in a hurry since we were in a race against time to get to the cabin before the darkness fell. But we had plenty of daylight if things went to plan, which in scouting, they never do. Mr. Carlson dropped us off with some of our stuff and told us that he'd be up there the next day with some peach cobbler. His peach cobbler was a hit with everyone and brought even a smile to the old grumpy Mr. Dawson. We set off to the cabin, in which Mr. Dawson instructed that the two oldest scouts to guide us there, using an old map and a compass. Mr. Dawson led up the rear to make sure that none of the scouts didn't venture off the path or fall behind. The thing about Mr. Dawson is that he knew the way to the cabin. He had been there multiple times, in fact, but he wanted to give the scouts an opportunity to earn the orientation merit badge. For him to do that, he was not going to interfere unless it was getting too late or someone was hurt. Unfortunately, we had plenty of time before the sun was going to set, and the two scouts leading us were not geographically inclined. The two scouts began leading us, and the rest did not contribute anything constructive in terms of directions, but we did liven the spirits with talks of sports and jokes. Mr. Dawson remained quiet. The path at first was clearly laid out and had signs for the first bit, but the further we went into the dense forest, the more things began to blend in. We finally came to a fork in the path. There was no sign signaling which way was north, which is where the cabin was. The two scouts tried using the compass, but both paths seemed to be going either northwest or northeast. After 2 minutes of exchanging the map between the two scouts, one of them spoke up and asked Mr. Dawson for a hint. He shrugged and chuckled. "I'm not the one getting the merit badge. If you want it, you gotta get us to the cabin before it gets dark," he said in his old southern accent. The scouts ahead of us eventually picked the path to the right. We continued hiking, but this time we were less sure of where we were going. Our packs began to feel heavy, and despite the cool air, I, for one, was beginning to sweat. It was around this time that the noise in the forest began to have a strange eeriness to it. The birds that were still out this time of year didn't seem to favor this part of the forest. My anxiety was climbing, more so from being lost rather than the change in environment that we were now entering. The path began to take a significant incline as we ventured further in. It was at this moment that we all began to hear a very strange sound. It was distant but familiar. My mind immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. It sounded like someone crying out in the woods. The scouts and even the leader began to slow down as we didn't know what to do. The closer we got, the more we realized that this crying was coming off the path and into the woods. We could see not too far off that there was an old decaying cabin that seemed to be the source of the noise. Normally, most people would ignore this and continue on. Too many red flags. However, this was different. We were Boy Scouts, and we were supposed to help people. The cabin was the biggest concern. If it looked normal, then we would have left, but since it looked abandoned, then we had to make sure that there wasn't someone in trouble. At this point, Mr. Dawson got involved. "I'm gonna take 4 scouts, and we're gonna go investigate. The rest of you scouts stay here so we don't lose the path." We all agreed, and he picked me and 3 other scouts to come with him. The cabin was covered in moss, and the wood looked old and twisted. The frame itself was slanted and looked unsafe to enter. The sound was more clear, and it sounded like an infant crying. Mr. Dawson did something that I'd never seen him do before. He unholstered his pistol and walked around the cabin perimeter, calling out to anyone inside. No one answered, and the crying continued. He went into the cabin and we followed. It didn't take us long to find the source of the noise, and to our shock, we realized that it was coming from an old radio that wasn't plugged in. One of the scouts turned off the radio and asked, "How is this possible?" Mr. Dawson looked around with a look of attentiveness. "We need to leave," he said. Right then the radio came on again, but this time it wasn't the crying sound. It played this eerie tune that I'd never heard before. The sound was unlike the crying and was distorted and warped, much like the rest of the cabin. We tried turning it off, but we had no luck, so we just left. When we got back to the trail, we were questioned by the other scouts and asked what was going on, if there was a baby down there. We told them that it was just this old creepy radio that we couldn't turn off. As creepy as it was, none of us really paid it any mind, especially since the one camping trip where an old woman was tweaking on drugs out in the woods, and we had to get the police involved. That creepy music kept playing, and Mr. Dawson took us back down to the fork in the path and led us up the correct way to the cabin. The hike took a bit longer than we anticipated, but thankfully, the cabin was prepped for all of us, so all we had to do was unload our stuff and gather some firewood to start the dinner. The cabin was equipped with a fireplace stove, so we didn't have to build a fire circle and cook outside. This made us feel a false sense of security, especially after the incredibly odd situation that we had just encountered on the trail. It didn't take us long to gather all the firewood that we could possibly need for the trip, since there was a good number of us and we were all hungry. As we were gathering the firewood, the sun slowly began to creep behind the horizon, abandoning us to what horrors the night had to offer. We brought the firewood to the cabin, leaving most of it outside since it would have made a mess. Mr. Dawson was quick in starting the stove, and we were cooking in no time. The stove acted as a heat source for the cabin, which was nice, since the early autumn coolness was beginning to be more chilling in the evening. It took all of us a couple of minutes to be able to cook all of our food, due to the sheer amount of scouts and the limited size of the wood-burning stove. We made makeshift seats around the stove, and we enjoyed our meals as they came off the stove, one by one. As we were eating, we naturally began talking. We talked about events in our lives, school, sports, Bigfoot, whatever 12-year-olds talk about at that age. I can't remember who brought up the old radio. The atmosphere in the cabin went from a playful bliss to a more sobering, dreadful result. It wasn't so much the topic itself, but rather the theories surrounding the event. Why would a radio station be playing crying sounds? One of the scouts asked. I don't know of any station that just plays bizarre sounds. How was the radio even playing? It wasn't connected to a power source, and I didn't see it have batteries, another scout mentioned. Mr. Dawson, while cooking up his meal, mentioned that he had heard of things like this before, as a war tactic. Play a sound of someone in help, whether a comrade or a helpless child, and draw in the enemy into an unsafe area to ambush them. That explains why he walked around the old cabin with his gun out. We slowly shifted talking about theories of what could have been trapping us to scary stories. This was way before Creepypasta Wiki or horror channels on YouTube. The stories that we were sharing were either first-hand accounts of ghosts or cryptids out in the woods or abandoned buildings. We all took turns having the spotlight of telling scary stories when Mr. Dawson shared with us a truly terrifying story. It was when he was younger and helping his uncle move cattle across the open plains. He said it took them about a week or so to move all the cattle from one town to the other, where they would sell them in bulk. His job was to take a head count every night to keep track if they lost any cattle that day. If they lost any, then his uncle would go back and backtrack and try to find them during the night. All the cattle were equipped with very loud bells, which made finding them quite easy, but sleeping near them very difficult. On the first couple of days of the cattle drive, the company began to notice that at night, something would be disturbing the cattle into a small frenzy, causing everyone to be woken up by the commotion. After a quick investigation, they would find that one of the cows had been attacked by something with large claws and was still bleeding. The wound was so severe that the cow was bound to die, either from infection or blood loss, so they ended up putting it down. Mr. Dawson explained that he had never seen a wound like that before. His only thought was that it must have been a bear of some kind, but He had never seen or even heard of bears being in that area. He then explained that he found himself having a hard time trying to sleep outside since he was exposed to whatever had injured that cow for the rest of the week. He had his theories on what he thought it could have been, but he wasn't for sure. The scout's eyes were wide and full of fear as the dim fire of the wood-burning stove began to slowly get lower. An unsettling silence fell on the group as they all considered the wide varieties of monsters and beasts that still could roam the open dark places of the world. Mr. Dawson then let out a shout to get the scouts to scream. The screams were shortly followed by laughter by both the scouts and the scoutmaster. The laughter eventually led to a silence as the scouts scoured their minds for the next scary story to share when they all began to hear a familiar tune, not too far off into the distance. The cabin provided a decent amount of soundproofing, however, the unnatural tune found its way slithering through the cracks and frame of the cabin like some old venomous serpent coming to bring ill tidings. It took the group only but a moment before dread had struck them all in the gut. The sound that they were hearing was the same song on the radio that they had encountered earlier that day. "Wait here," Mr. Dawson said while standing up, unholstering his pistol again and opening the cabin door. He wasn't out there long before he came back in. The eerie tune crept off into the night, out of earshot, yet the bad feelings that had dragged here remained. All of our ears strained to hear more of the music, but it was gone. Out of earshot, yet the bad feelings that had dragged here remained. All of our ears strained to hear more of the music, but it was gone. At this point of the evening, we decided the best thing to do was to stock up on firewood, keep it near the stove, but most importantly, keep the cabin door closed. Mr. Dawson took the only available room to sleep in while the rest of the scouts spread out their sleeping bags around the dim but still warm wood-burning stove. The smooth crackling of the fire provided a calming effect to our young minds. However, the treacherous evil we had encountered earlier still dwelled in the shadows of uncertainty. No amount of security could make us feel safe while out in these woods, but the locked cabin door would have to do. Our nightly routine of inappropriate jokes was sidetracked, as none of us wanted to disturb the quiet air that kept us hidden inside the cabin. Despite the high anxiety and fear that we all were experiencing, the 5 miles we hiked up to this cabin had taken its toll on us. Much like the fire in the stove, our minds slowly dwindled into darkness, and we all found ourselves fast asleep. I don't remember falling asleep, but I do remember waking up. It felt as if I hadn't even fallen asleep in the first place. The first thing that I noticed, before anything else, was it. Standing in the nearest window, roughly 4 feet away from me, was a gaunt creature. At first I thought it was an old man, but it didn't take long before I realized that it wasn't. Its skin was gray and wrinkled like the bark of an old tree. Its eyes were sunken like dark pits that had no end. I couldn't see the eyes themselves, but I could feel their icy gaze violate me as it scanned its unholy sight upon me. For the brief moment that I was the only one awake, this creature and I shared a tormenting few seconds of silence and fear. I was paralyzed, but I could tell that this thing was delighted, that I was petrified. It seemed to feed off my fear like some kind of grotesque parasite, latching itself to the most vulnerable part of my soul. I thought this would be the most horrific thing I'd ever have to encounter in my life, but I was wrong. The hideous creature that was only separated by a thin-paned window began to do something horrifying. The silence was broken by the familiar singing of that eerie tune from earlier. This creature was now singing it loudly, while also trying to do what I could only assume to be dancing. The creature moved rigidly, like its body was stiff from decay. Its dancing almost felt like a taunt, like it had me right where it wanted me, and there was nothing I could do to escape the inevitable doom that was sure to come.
The singing caused me to break the trance of fear and allowed me to finally scream to alert everyone else. All the scouts slowly woke from their blissful dreams that granted them ignorance to the horrors that laid outside. It didn't take them long to see what I was screaming at, and they also followed in screams of terror. Mr. Dawson was a heavy sleeper. Even with the screams of the scouts and the creatures singing quite loudly, he lay tucked away in the other room. 2 of the scouts were brave enough to open the door to the other room and wake the old scoutmaster, to hopefully rid us of this terror. Once awake, the scoutmaster knew almost instantly what was going on. He hopped out of bed while only wearing his evening apparel, which consisted of some socks, old faded boxers, and a white t-shirt. He grabbed his pistol and made his way for the door. Our screams then turned to shouts and pleads to stay inside, but the old man was determined to do what he wanted. He unlocked the door, and before he opened it all the way, the creature stopped singing and rushed the door with an unnatural bolt of speed and fury that I'd never seen before. The door flung open, hitting poor Mr. Dawson right in the face, causing him to fall violently. The fall probably did more damage than the door, as he let out a loud huff of pain when he landed. His face streamed blood quite quickly, which soon began to run onto his t-shirt. Despite the door hitting him and having the wind knocked out of him, Mr. Dawson was able to sit upright and aim his pistol at the creature, whose figure now stood in the doorway. His aim, despite the blood obscuring his sight, was rather on the mark, as the gunshots briefly illuminated the cabin with flashes of orange light coming from the pistol. Chunks of the creature blew off, but the bullets didn't seem to faze the creature. The creature's quick burst of speed quickly closed the gap between itself and Mr. Dawson. The next thing we all knew, the creature's nails gripped into his head much like someone were to palm a basketball and lifted him off the ground. Mr. Dawson let out screams of pain as the creature then lifted the screaming scoutmaster, and then began slamming him down head first into the wooden floor. Mr. Dawson sustained 2 powerful hits before his screams were silenced. The creature continued until the floor began to break under the high force of slams. Once lifeless, the creature then dragged Mr. Dawson out of the cabin and off into the woods. All of the scouts were either screaming or crying. Our only leader, who was responsible for keeping us safe, had been viciously slammed into a pulp effortlessly, all right before our eyes. One of the older scouts jumped up and slammed the door shut while locking it. All the other scouts began to place furniture around the door to provide a barricade to our only line of defense of that creature. The hour was late in the night, but there was no chance that any of us were going to find sleep after this gruesome event that just unfolded in front of our innocent minds. It took the troop around a good 30 minutes before we began to calm down. It didn't dawn on us right then, but we eventually realized that our way back to town was a 5-mile hike in the very forest in which this creature lived. If we were to ever make it back out of here, we would eventually have to take the chance and hike back. An hour later, just when we thought things were going to be calm, we heard the same chilling tune off in the distance. Much like before, the creature was also dancing, except this time it began to twirl something. It had 2 items in each of its hands. The closer the creature got, the better we were able to see that the creature was twirling the arms of the scout leader that had been ripped off his body. The scouts began to scream again as the creature danced around the cabin. The creature wasn't trying to get inside the cabin. It was just taunting us again. The creature eventually threw the arms at the cabin, making a loud thud, and danced its way back into the woods. The sun eventually made its way back into our lives, as we spent the longest night of our lives waiting for the creature to come back to eat us. Once the sun came out, the creature had yet to make an appearance. The scouts began to theorize about the creature. Maybe it doesn't like light. Why does it sing that song? Is that a demon of some kind? These were the ideas that we all shared with one another. We finally came to the conclusion that the creature was a demon of some kind, from a dark place, and that it didn't like light. That's why we hadn't seen it since the sun came up. We finally came up with a plan to get out of here. We were going to split up into 2 groups and hike back. If the creature were to get one group, then the other would have a chance to get away. As we were getting our plans all figured out, we saw someone come out of the woodline. With the events of last night, we had all forgotten about Mr. Carlson coming up today. Mr. Carlson came walking towards the cabin while carrying all his stuff when another figure appeared behind him. Mr. Carlson was about 30 yards away from the cabin and was in the middle of us and the other figure in the woods. We all began to scream for him to run to us as we tried unblocking the door, for all the furniture was still there. To our surprise, the figure behind Mr. Carlson was Mr. Dawson. For a brief moment, we were all very confused to what we were seeing. Did Mr. Dawson survive the attack from the creature? Mr. Carlson stopped as he turned around to see Mr. Dawson standing in the woodline. Our shouts must have been muffled by the cabin as he seemed to ignore us and walk over to Mr. Dawson. Once we were able to get the cabin door unblocked, we were finally able to yell at Mr. Carlson to tell him to run to us. In response, Mr. Dawson began to dance and sing much like the creature we encountered earlier. This wasn't Mr. Dawson. It was the creature imitating him. We all left the cabin and sprinted to Mr. Carlson to pull him inside, but the creature began to transform back into that hideous form. Mr. Carlson watched in horror as Mr. Dawson transformed into the most terrifying beast he had ever seen. Like before, the creature grabbed the head of Mr. Carlson and dragged him off into the woods, as Mr. Carlson screamed for his life. Some of us took the opportunity to run back into the trail and hopefully make it back, while others ran back to the cabin. My fear overtook my body as my mind instinctively ran on the trail leading back into town. The 5 miles went by quickly as my adrenaline carried me most of the way back. Once I reached the base of the trail, my adrenaline had been flushed from my body, as well as the handful of scouts that had followed me, and we collapsed in front of a family that was unloading a minivan for a hike. We were somehow able to find the strength to scream at them that our scout leaders were dead and that they should call the police. The police came and rounded up the scouts that made it back and questioned us about where the cabin was. We gave them the correct information and made their way off into the woods, while the paramedics took us to the hospital. The remaining scouts that stayed back in the cabin were found inside. All of them had been killed. The door had been broken down and their bodies thrown about. They had no leads on who or what had did this, and they ended up closing that part of the trail that led to the cabin. I haven't been back in those woods since. Not just those woods, but any woods in general. My warning goes out to those of you who might find themselves in the woods this time of year. If you hear crying, just turn back. Nothing good will happen if you investigate. My older brother Sean came home from one of his deployments overseas and decided to take me out camping. Sean's girlfriend had dumped him, which was a bad situation, so he was looking to get his mind off of things. Sean is older than me by about 12 years, which is an obvious disconnect, but he's done a good job staying in touch and being a part of my life. I do have other siblings, but they've moved on, and I seldomly see them every year or so. Sean picked me up from school on Wednesday in his big old blue diesel truck. In the front seat, he had a wrinkled bag of McDonald's, and the truck bed was full of camping gear. I opened the slightly rusted passenger side door and hopped in. He greeted me with a smile and handed me the small bag of food while blaring some type of rock and roll music. "Ready to go, L-Bug?" he said excitedly. Ladybug was my nickname growing up, since I'd always wear this ladybug dress, but Sean called me L-Bug for short. Only Sean called me L-Bug, which I thought was really cool. I gave Sean a wide smile and nodded excitedly. We left the school parking lot and made our way off into the country where Sean was going to teach me how to fish. Apparently, there was this secret fishing hole where he and his friends would go to catch all of these incredible fish that no one knew about. "You're lucky I don't blindfold you," he said jokingly. "People kill for fishing spots like this." Being young and gullible, my eyes widened at the thought of people actually killing someone for a fishing spot. Sean, seeing my clear discomfort, told me not to worry, and that he was only kidding. The drive wasn't terribly far,
but the scenery had completely changed from the suburban neighborhood community that I knew all my life to the lively woodlands that were so foreign to me. "How did you find this place?" I asked Sean, while still scarfing down my food. "Oh, Uncle Brian would take me here to have target practice. Which reminds me," he said with a grin while pointing to the bed of the truck. In the back, I could see your typical camping equipment, but 2 strangely shaped bags that looked similar to guitar cases. I could only assume that those were guns of some kind, but I wasn't sure. We eventually pulled off into the woods and started driving on a dirt road, surrounded by woods. About 10 minutes driving on this dirt road, we arrived at a large dirt mound with a wooden sawhorse on top, with a cardboard sign that said "closed" on it. "Aw, dang," I said disappointedly, as this was clearly where we were going to go for the fishing spot. Sean looked around as if he was trying to see if anyone else was around, which there clearly wasn't anyone, and told me to hop out of the truck and move the sign. I looked at Sean confused, since I had no idea if he was joking or if he was being serious. The devilish grin didn't help, but I hopped out anyways. I moved the wooden sawhorse, which was actually kind of heavy, just enough to where he could drive the truck up and over the dirt mound. The diesel truck made light work of the rather inconvenient obstacle, and sure enough, cleared the mound in one attempt. I was about to hop back into the truck when he told me to move the sign back where it was. That way, no one else would be following us, unless they did what we did, obviously. I moved the sign back and hopped back into the truck, and made off for the hidden fishing spot deep within the woods. After 15 minutes or so of driving in unkept areas of the forest, we soon came to an area that looked clear enough to come and park the truck. The daylight was still pretty strong, but soon would be fading within a few hours, so we had to hurry and get camp set up before we could go fish. My brother, being a paranoid one, placed a camo-colored tarp on the truck to conceal anyone from our spot. We didn't bother with the fire quite yet, since we wanted to go fish before the sun would go down. We set up our tent quickly and threw our sleeping bags inside. Before we knew it, we were on our way down to the secret fishing spot that my brother was so eager to show me. Despite the secret fishing spot historically being great for yielding large fish, this particular time didn't repeat past results, and not for lack of effort, mind you. We didn't catch anything in the 2 hours we spent fishing in that spot. Even though nothing was accomplished and the fish weren't biting, my brother and I still had a great conversation about a lot of things. We hiked back in the darkening evening, empty-handed, and started a small fire in the makeshift fire pit, and started cooking our hobo dinners. We kept the fire small just in case there happened to be someone out in the woods that would report us to the police for whatever reason. The dinners were not exactly fine dining, but they did their jobs, and we sat by the fire with full bellies. My brother Sean shared with me a couple of war stories which were both cool and terrifying at the same time. He got out one of his guns and just showed me some of the cool features about it, but we didn't fire it. The gun he showed me was some type of machine gun that looked quite complex. Sean made sure it was unloaded before handing me the gun to get a feel for it. The gun was heavy and felt awkward in my hands. I could only imagine having to carry this all over and firing it at people with similar weapons. I handed it back, thankful that I was not in combat. We let the fire die down and told more stories to one another before we called it a night. The night was not terribly cold, but it was cooler during the evening than it was during the day. We got into the tent and I just laid on top of my sleeping bag, and sleep eventually found me. I only got a couple hours of sleep before I felt a gentle nudge waking me up. My brother was shaking my foot while peering outside the tent. "Do you hear that?" he said in a whisper. My ears strained to hear any sound, and sure enough, I did. It didn't take long for me to hear the screams of the woman to reach my ears. The screams sent shivers down my spine, despite being off in the distance somewhere. We both looked outside the tent in the distance, and we saw what looked like a couple of torches, not too far off into the trees. The night was much cooler now. I could see my breath and I was shivering. I put on a light jacket and wrapped a scarf around most of my face. My brother had a camo jacket and was holding one of the rifles from earlier in his right hand. L-Bug, hang tight. I'm gonna go check this out. Get ready to leave soon. Sean then left me in the tent by myself while he went to investigate the nefarious activities, taking place only a few hundred yards away. I started to pack up, but then felt this urge to follow behind Sean, despite what he told me to do. Sean was practically sprinting without a flashlight towards the torches that seemed to be going up this hill. We would have been okay if we just ignored them, but the screams for help were ones that Sean and I just could not ignore. Sean was much faster than I was. Thankfully, the torches were moving at a walking pace, so it took him little to no time to close the gap and keep a safe distance while also keeping an eye on them. I wanted to make sure that Sean wouldn't find me if he turned back, so I also made sure to keep a safe buffer between he and I, but I also watched to see what was unfolding in front of us. When I finally stopped some yards behind Sean, I could see a couple dozen men wearing blue cloaks with white masks. They were all holding torches in one hand while carrying various types of sharp weapons in the other, all except for one. The person not holding a weapon was pulling someone with a leash, much like you would a dog that doesn't want to follow you. The person that they were dragging along was wearing some type of white dress. They were blindfolded and wailing as if that they knew that their fate was sealed. We followed them for a small distance when they arrived at an old covered well and stopped. The woman continued to weep when some of the cloaked people started to remove the heavy circular stone that was on top of the well. Sean aimed his weapon at the people and emerged from the tree line and started shouting. "Let her go," he shouted in a commanding tone. All of the people there, including the wailing woman, stopped what they were doing and looked at Sean. Sean got closer to the group and demanded that they cut her ties. "We cannot do that. This isn't a real person. You have to trust us," said one of the people holding a large knife to the woman's throat. Sean flipped some buttons on his gun and shot off 2 rounds near the people's feet. The woman that was blindfolded jumped, but no one else did. They just continued to stare an icy cold stare at Sean, completely unfazed. You could tell that something wasn't right about these people. Rather than letting the woman go, the majority of the group began to slowly walk towards Sean, weapons in hand, completely unafraid of his gun. The people were getting too close to Sean and he had no choice but to fire at them. This caused instant chaos amongst everyone. Despite having a weapon, the people in the ropes were too many and quickly jumped Sean. Sean was able to hit most of them, but not all. 2 people ended up wrestling Sean for his gun. The one person holding the bound woman started to stab her viciously and dragged her over to the well. The 2 people were able to disarm Sean and started to drag him to the well also. Sean's gun laid only 20 yards away from me. I knew I needed to help, but I was so afraid. My body seemed to have acted on its own. After a quick sprint, the next thing I knew, I was holding the heavy gun and pointing at the people that had my brother. "Hey, let him go!" I shouted with all I had. The people still wrestling Sean were too busy and didn't even respond. I was left with no choice and fired the remaining bullets in the direction of the people. Sean laid on the ground covering his head as the people around him fell in agony. The gun jumped so much that I was certain that I had just killed everyone. Thankfully, Sean was able to get up and fight the last person that I managed to not kill and subdue them. The woman laid near the well bleeding from all the stab wounds. Her attacker fell victim to the barrage of bullets that I had sent their way. "Don't let her see your face," the last cloaked man said. Sean struck the man a few times in the face, causing his mask to fall off. The man was unconscious and we both ran over to the woman that was surely going to die. We cut her ties and applied pressure to the woman's wounds on her abdomen. The woman took the blindfold off, revealing these large black eyes. She looked at Sean perplexed rather than agony and smiled. Her smile revealed multiple rows of sharp teeth. Sean stopped almost instantly what he was doing and stood upright with his arms by his side. She stood in front of him, revealing large claws on her hand, and began to laugh. I stood mystified at what was going on. She then grasped his neck tightly, removing most of the flesh on his throat. The scene was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The amount of blood that resulted from this action told me that he had died before he hit the ground. The woman smiled and looked over at me. I was still holding the gun, but whenever I pulled the trigger, nothing happened. Instead, I stood in fear as the woman looked into my eyes. Rather than her grabbing my throat and removing it, she looked confused at me, as if I was something that she'd never seen before. She tried grabbing the scarf that covered my face, but I pressed my hands to it to prevent her from seeing my face. The woman then looked past me and saw all the bodies that laid behind me. She instantly went to the man whose mask had fallen off and repeated the same action she did to my brother. For whatever reason, I knew that having my face concealed is what prevented that woman from killing me. She was preoccupied from killing the rest of the people that she didn't notice me running away. I ran back in the dark to our tent and looked for the keys to the truck. I didn't know how to drive stick, so it was pointless. I just stayed in the tent until daytime came, since running around in the dark would be pointless since I didn't know where I was going. Daytime came and I made sure to keep my scarf on. I followed the trail that my brother and I took and made it back to the main dirt road, which eventually led to a campsite with a family there. I told them what had happened and they took me into town with their whole family. The police got involved, but unbelievably, no body was ever found. I told them about the woman and the people in the cloaks, but they didn't seem to believe me. My parents think that something else happened, and I made this up to cope with the trauma from all of it, but deep down, I knew the truth of what had happened in those woods. The chanting in the woods. I don't sleep with my window open anymore. No matter how hot outside it gets, that window stays closed. It's been this way for a long time, since I was very young. It's not a real hit with the ladies during the summertime. People usually recommend air conditioners, and I usually go with the prospect when I have the company. But when it's in, I don't usually sleep well at all because I can only imagine how easy it would be for anyone to bypass them. There is a single perk to the AC though, well, besides the relief from the hot stickiness of the summer's humidity, and that's the steady hum which stifles the silence. I don't like the silence, you see. There was a time when it brought me an almost zen-like level of peace and tranquility, but now I find it invasive, dangerous. Silence never comes alone. From time to time, I can still hear the chanting from my youth. I can hear them all, wordlessly and yet with prestigious synchronicity and harmony with one another. Their conjoined voices echo from the woods like the gentle and yet threatening breeze that precedes a violent hailstorm, rhythmic yet senseless. It never went away, and yet I know they've all moved on or died. I know this all very well. When I was about 9 years old, my dad and I lived in this old rented 2-family apartment house in the town called Bridgewater in the state of Massachusetts. We lived on the bottom floor. The second floor wasn't used. It was recently vacated by its prior residents. It was a very quiet neighborhood, very suburban with plenty of woods. Behind our house there was a backyard that proceeded into a large forest that spanned it out for miles. I used to play in them. My dad and mother were recently divorced, so there were just the 3 of us living here. Me, him, and the dog, Cash, who was named after the late country singer, Jonny Cash. He was an old Scottish terrier, you know the type, ankle biters with these really ugly, bearded faces. They got him as a pup when I was still in diapers, and he was a lifelong friend. He may have been something of an idiot, but at the time, he was all I had. I cried and cried when my mom tried to take him. In the end, he was left in my father's care, for my sake. Cash and I would spend a lot of time playing in the woods. When you're young, your imagination is a very powerful thing, and the woods had an almost magic quality in the terms of supplementation for my imagination. I would play army, build forts, climb trees. One time me and Cash traveled so far in the woods, I actually got lost. We were losing daylight as it was October, and the light was fading at a much faster rate. I began to panic, afraid I'd be trapped out here in the pitch black. As we walked around, frantic for landmarks, anything familiar, that's when I saw it. The clearing, with a large rock in the center. It wasn't exactly uncommon to see graffiti and vandalism in the woods. A public forest is quite well known for trees with messages carved into them. Names, swastikas, Brad, InGen Forever, and a nice cute heart. Stuff like that. Not to mention the pseudo-gang names spray-painted on rocks. That was my impression I got of this place. A hangout for older kids. But something wasn't right. Me being only 9, my mind wasn't exactly capable of comprehending the connotations of symbols and other things. And yet there was something really off about these images. I've never seen anything like them before. The surrounding trees had crudely shaped images of what appeared to be a goat-man hybrid, like a stick figure with an unnecessarily detailed goat head imposed over where you would expect to see a very basic stick figure face. These images were drawn over and over and over again, all over the trees that surrounded the clearing. Almost obsessively so, and not just the basic human height level, but all up the trees, as if whoever carved them had to use a ladder. The rock itself had red markings all over it, letters that I've never seen before. Underneath, though, was written in black spray paint, a message I could actually read. It said, "Behold the wisdom of the horned," and below that were 5 painted lines. They were all the same height except for the 2 outer lines that were twice the height and spiraled outwards at the top. What really scared me about this place, though, were the dolls. They were hanging from the branches around the clearing. They appeared to have been woven out of sticks, and poorly so. Taking a closer look, I realized what was so scary about them. While the sticks of the dolls were clearly constructed of the grace of crappy arts and crafts students, the heads of them were dry and clean skulls of animals. I don't know what of, but they were bleached white, dry and clean. Their hollow sockets. I can't explain it effectively without sounding insane, but there was something sentient about them, watchful and pleading. I could feel their eyes on me, though they had none to watch with. I felt fear. Not my own fear, mind you, but something, an aura of emotion that made absolutely no sense. Have you ever been at an underage drinking party that got crashed by the police? It's that kind of fear. The fear that comes synonymously with trouble. I can't explain why I did it, but I reached up and touched one. Maybe it was a child's general inquisitive nature that compelled me. Maybe it was fascination, or an intense desire to quell my fear and convince myself that they were just dolls and not watchful spirits I would eventually come to believe they were. When I touched it, the skull fell off. The doll unwound itself, only a piece of it remained attached to the rawhide rope that it was suspended from. The skull cracked when it hit the ground. When it happened, there was a certain quality that quelled inside me. As naive as my 9-year-old could be, there was also a certainty that remained with me to this day. I don't belong here. Cash immediately started barking when the doll fell. It startled me so effectively that I let out a scream. I looked up. The sky was glowing red with darkness not too far behind. The sun was going down and I had to get out of here. Cash was staring at me, black eyes wide open and tail wagging violently. He was barking at me insistently. He began to growl at something, maybe air, maybe ghosts. When I approached him, he turned and ran. Cash was my only companion in this unnatural place, and I would be darned if I was going to let him betray me into solitude here. So I gave chase. I ran for my life. The last thing I saw before I chased Cash was something that really messed with me. All the other dolls that were hanging when I first arrived were dangling. Some were even spinning lazily in the breeze. And yet as I ran after Cash, I saw every single doll on site was completely stationary, staring and facing me directly. I was dismissive of this detail as I was more afraid of being alone. I never let Cash out of my sight. He led me straight home. I never loved my dog more than when I realized what he had done for me. Dogs are never lost. They always know their way. Dark Woods Demon by Jonny and Elisha Henderson. Author's note: this story is based on actual events. Jacob cursed as he pushed through the thick underbrush trying to make his way to the tree stand he had built earlier in the summer. He was certain that this location would give him an optimal line of sight to the neighboring field in which he frequently saw large herds of deer. This was going to be his year, and he was sure of it. This is the year that I bring home my trophy buck, he thought, as he recalled the events of the day so far. He had awakened at 4:30 a.m. He began to prepare for the long day in the woods, on the backside of his farm. His first order of business had been to locate and rescue his gloves and camouflage hunting gear from whatever undisclosed area of his home that his wife had hidden them. He would most assuredly need them this morning to protect him from the bitter cold November morning. How could it be this cold this early in the year? He wondered as he started to work on his second task of the day, which was to prepare a breakfast that would stick to his ribs long enough into the day. He wasn't entirely sure what he wanted this morning, but he finally settled on toast, country ham, and scrambled eggs that were just a little too runny. He topped it all off with a large cup of coffee that left a bitter taste in his tongue. In fact, he could still taste it. After accomplishing task 1 and 2, he packaged himself a bologna and cheese sandwich for lunch, grabbed his Remington 30-06 hunting rifle, a thermos of coffee, and headed out the door. He loaded his gear into his truck and pulled out into the driveway and turned right into the one-lane blacktop road that led to the backside of his property. After about 2¼ miles, he turned right again off the blacktop onto a dirt road that was gouged with deep, mud-filled ruts. He had traveled about another half-mile down that pitiful rut-filled excuse for a road when he came to his desired location. He got out of his truck and loaded his gun and sauntered off into the woods. Jacob had gone little more than 500 yards into the densely wooded tree line when he began to wish that he had put on an extra layer of clothing to shield him against the chilly morning air. 10 minutes out of the truck and he was already cold, and it was made worse by the cloudy, overcast day and the wind that was blowing steadily through the trees, making the autumn leaves rattle like dry bones. Oh well, he thought, it's going to be a good day anyways, especially if I bring home a big one. Jacob took about 10 more steps when an uneasy feeling began to creep over him. He felt as though someone had stepped over his grave. He got a distinct feeling that he was being watched. But by whom? This was his property and it was posted. No one had permission to be on his land. He had to be alone. But if he was alone, why couldn't he shake the eerie feeling that was scratching at the base of his skull? Something was off today. There was a deafening silence there in the forest. No birds or insects, only the sound of the wind in the trees. Convincing himself that it was nothing more than the case of nerves, he continued to press on until he came to a clearing not far from his tree stand. Stepping into the clearing, Jacob saw the remains of what appeared to be a large deer. He wasn't quite able to make out what he was seeing from the distance, because the sun wasn't completely up yet, and the forest was still enveloped in shadows. Jacob walked closer to get a better look, and found that he had been correct. It was a deer, a large 8-point buck in fact. Looking at the remains, he felt a sense of dread come over him, and icy fingers dance along his spine. Something about this kill just doesn't seem right. The throat was completely torn out and the stomach was ripped open. Plus, several of the internal organs were missing. It was the most grisly thing he'd ever seen. This definitely wasn't a coyote kill, and no hunter would have done this. They would have taken the head to have it mounted. What could have done this, he wondered. A fear like nothing he'd ever experienced before began to wash over him in waves. What is going on, he thought. At nearly 225 pounds and well over 6 foot, he wasn't one to give in to fear. But now, he couldn't seem to calm down, and his heart was beating like a trip hammer. The feeling that he was being watched was getting stronger by the minute, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was moments away from a bad situation. He slowly started to back away from the mangled carcass and head back to his truck, and back to safety. No more than 6 steps into his journey, his blood turned to ice in his veins, as a deep, guttural, wailing scream shattered the eerie silence and what was left of his courage. He had grown up on the farm all his life and had been an experienced hunter since childhood. He was familiar with every animal in this part of the state, Not even a cougar, bobcat, or bear could have produced the scream that had torn through the early morning forest and filled him with such bone-chilling apprehension. Primal fear now gave way to stark terror as he chambered around into his .30-06 and turned around only to find there was nothing behind him. His mind raced with confusion and he was confronted with a million thoughts at once. What should I do? What could it be? Should I run? Am I going to die? His survival senses kicking into overdrive. Jacob decided to continue on his previously contrived plan, which was to go to the truck and get out of there while the getting was good. Slowly and cautiously, he made his way towards the perceived salvation of his vehicle, silently praying every step of the way. With 300 yards separating him from his only avenue of escape, Jacob began to hear heavy footfalls off to his left. He could hear the crunching of withered leaves, sticks, and debris that littered the forest floor. Summoning every ounce of courage that remained within him, he forced himself to look to that direction. And that's when he saw the dark silhouette that followed him through the densely tangled forest. Quickening his pace, he redoubled his efforts to reach the truck and get to a phone and call the sheriff, the game warden, or anyone that would listen. He couldn't tell what it was that was stalking him, but he could clearly see that it towered more than 7 feet and was incredibly massive. Jacob couldn't help but think that he was about to become a national statistic, a person who left home under normal circumstances and just disappeared without a trace. How many people, he wondered, go into the woods and just vanish, and the authorities just assume that he'd just become lost or injured, or even become the victim of animal attacks, with their bodies never being recovered. Please, God, don't let this happen to me, he thought, as he drew closer and closer to his truck. 75 yards became 50, and 50 became 30, and 30 became 10. Like a miracle, he was back and opening his door. Throwing his rifle inside, he pulled himself up into the cab and started the engine and hit the gas, but the truck went nowhere. He had parked in a large mud puddle, and now the tires simply spun, slinging mud 30 feet behind him. Oh no, not now, he thought. I can't be stuck, not now. Allowing himself a moment to think, Jacob remembered that his truck is a 4-wheel drive. There's no way it can be stuck. Reaching down, he locked his truck into 4-wheel drive and was prepared to punch the gas and leave this nightmare behind. Unfortunately for Jacob, some nightmares are not so easily left behind, and there's nothing worse than a nightmare you can't wake from, and Jacob was about to learn that the hard way. Hearing something to his right, he instinctively turned and immediately wished that he had not. It took him maybe half a second to turn his head, but he would have given anything in the world to have that half second back, because it was the last moment that his world would ever seem normal again. In that split second, his world changed. It was no longer a place where the world was light and safe, where he was just a husband and a father, and a guy that liked to hunt and watch football on the weekends. That reality had evaporated away like the early morning fog, and all that was left was a world where monsters existed, and things really went bump in the night. And now an ambassador from that nightmare realm was just standing outside his passenger door, a visible reminder that his world had been turned upside down. Jacob screamed as he stared, transfixed on this escapee from a horror movie, in the most terrifying, fevered dream he could ever imagined that such thing could ever exist. It was hideously ugly, standing 8 feet tall with a thick, muscular body. It looked very apish in appearance, but then again, it didn't. There was just something about the face that was just wrong, almost like an obscene amalgamation of man and animal that had gone horribly awry. It was the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen. It was completely covered with thick, shaggy black hair that was matted in areas with God only knows what, and it walked on 2 legs. Not 4 like you would expect from some kind of animal. What was this thing that had shattered his perception of reality? Was it a demon? A werewolf? It can't be, he thought. Those things don't exist. Maybe it was some kind of reject from the island of Dr. Moreau. Whatever it was staring at him, and it didn't look happy. The menacing juggernaut threw its enormous head back and let out a blood-curdling scream, that resonated throughout the surrounding area and seemed to vibrate him to his very core. Shocked back into action, Jacob threw his truck into gear and took off as though he was being chased by the very hounds of hell. Jacob, mind racing, wondered what he was going to do. How will I ever feel safe on this farm again, he thought. Are my wife and children in danger? Where did this thing come from, and will anyone believe me? The whirlwind of thoughts that swirled through Jacob's mind came to an immediate stop as he slammed on his brakes and nearly slid off the road. In a state of disbelief, Jacob sat staring at the large hackberry tree that laid across the dirt road and blocked his path, preventing him from reaching the blacktop and guaranteed safety. How is this even possible, he thought. I just came down this road not even 30 minutes ago, and the path was clear. However this tree came to be across the road, it was painfully obvious to Jacob that he had to get out and move the tree if he was going to make it home. Since he had neither chain to pull the tree out of the road, nor did he have a saw which he could cut out this unexpected barricade, he was left with few viable options, one of which was walking, which he discounted almost immediately. The most logical course of action that he could come up with was to call for help. His best friend Kenny Patterson owned the farm just over from his. If he were home, he could bring a saw and cut the tree up for him. Jacob, with his nerves still frazzled and frayed, reached into his glove box and pulled out his cell phone and clumsily dialed Kenny's number. The phone rang 6 times and Jacob was about to give up when Kenny answered the phone and said, "Hey, ugly, what do you want this early in the morning?" As quickly as he could, he related the recent events to Kenny and said, "Man, please hurry. I'm not kidding, there's something out here." Kenny, hearing the shakiness in his friend's voice, assured him that he would be there in a matter of minutes. Jacob thanked him and hung up the phone and braced himself for what he assured to be the longest few minutes of his life. Sitting there motionless with bated breath there in the truck, every sound made his imagination run with fear and expectance. Even though little more than 3 minutes had passed since he had spoken to Kenny, it felt as if hours had passed. Each tick of the clock seemed to be an eternity. Jacob frequently checked in all directions for any sign that nightmarish monstrosity had pursued him. In every shadow that the forest and this irritatingly cloudy day produced, he thought he saw the shape of the black beast that followed him out of the woods, and he was afraid that he would lose his sanity long before Kenny arrived to clear the tree out of his pathway. After what seemed like a lifetime, Jacob heard the sound of Kenny's old truck sputtering up the road, and in just moments he was able to see the old red Chevrolet as it made its way closer to him. Jacob's spirits lifted when he saw his old friend, and a sense of relief wash over him as he realized he was no longer alone. Stepping out of his truck, Jacob said, "Man, what took you so long? I asked you to hurry." Kenny, with an indignant look on his face, said, "What are you talking about? You only called me 11 minutes ago. I think I made pretty good time." Jacob could hardly believe that only 11 minutes had passed. It seemed so much longer. After apologizing to his friend and telling him exactly how happy he was to see him, both men walked over to the fallen tree and made a discovery that startled them both. The tree had not broken. It had not been cut. It had been pushed over and completely uprooted. All around the tree were large bipedal footprints that had a somewhat human appearance to them, but if they were human, the owner would require a size 28 shoe. Jacob and Kenny looked at each other, and then without a word went to work on the tree. Kenny took a chainsaw from the bed of his truck and began to cut the fallen blockade. Meanwhile, Jacob pulled the logs and debris from the road. Mission accomplished. Kenny put away his saw, and he and Jacob were about to get in their vehicles and leave. But before either man had even opened their doors, an ear-splitting scream that would have filled a banshee with paralyzing fear erupted from the woods behind them. Warily, Jacob walked over to Kenny and whispered, "That's what I was telling you about. I don't know what that thing is, man, but it looks like some kind of monster. I think we need to get out of here. Now." Kenny, who looked as though the blood had drained completely out of his face, became very pale as he said to Jacob, "Jacob, man, I've never mentioned this to anyone before now, but over the last few months, that thing has been killing off a few of my cows. Their throats are usually torn out and the bodies are mangled and broken. I didn't want anyone to accuse me of being crazy and making stuff up, so I never said anything about it. But that's the reason I rushed over when you called. I've heard the sounds a few times off in the distance, at night, but never this close, so I think you're right, old buddy. It is time to go." Cautiously and with a sense of urgency,
Jacob and Kenny climbed into their vehicles and expeditiously made their way back to the blacktop. Turning left, both vehicles began the 2.5-mile trek that led back to Jacob's house, so they could decide what course of action they should take. Jacob could feel the temperature drop as snow began to fall gently. He reached over and turned his wipers on as the snow began to pelt the windshield harder. As he passed his neighbor, William Springer's farm, he noticed a herd of deer grazing in the field that bordered his property. Having put a bit of distance between himself and the nightmare he had just encountered, Jacob felt a renewed sense of security as his fatigued nerves began to calm. Not willing to let this opportunity pass by, Jacob turned on his hazard lights and pulled to the shoulder off the road, and signaled Kenny to do the same. Kenny instinctively knew what Jacob was thinking as he pulled in behind him and turned his ignition off. Getting out of his truck, Kenny said, "What are you doing, man? We need to get out of here now." Jacob said, I know. And we will. Just a minute, man. I can't just turn this down. I have to take the shot. That is a 6-point buck over there. It's not the trophy that I wanted, but at least I won't go home empty-handed. And after the morning I think we've had, I think we deserved a little something good. All right, just take the shot so we can go. I still don't feel right about this, Kenny said. Steadying his rifle across the hood of his truck, Jacob zeroed in on the buck and prepared to fire. That's when he heard Kenny making a gasping noise and whispered, "Oh my God. What is it, man? What's wrong with you?" "Raise your scope 3 inches, he said. Raising the scope 3 inches, Jacob immediately saw what had been the cause of Kenny's alarm. Standing just outside of the tree line in the edge of the field was the creature that they had left behind. Not even 5 minutes. Was this thing following them? Was it after the deer? What was it doing? Jacob watched the creature through the scope for a full 30 seconds before it ever moved, and when it did, it ignored him and the deer and started to lope off towards William's barn that was just 500 yards away from where the woodland demon had just been standing. Jacob called out to Kenny and said, "Kenny, call William and tell him that there's something trying to get into his barn. I know he has at least 2 mares with foals in there, and if that thing gets in, it will kill all of them." In an attempt to be rid of this monster, werewolf, Sasquatch, Wendigo, or whatever it was, Jacob fired a shot but missed. The creature turned to their direction and glared at them through red, hateful eyes, and then began to run towards them at full steam. Kenny, who was still on the phone with William, screamed at Jacob to get in his truck and go. Jacob did as he was told, and Kenny followed suit. Starting their trucks, Jacob and Kenny both raced to Jacob's house, as though they were driving on the NASCAR circuit. Arriving at home, Jacob, gun in hand, ran inside and get the phone book so he could call the game warden and the police and get some kind of animal control out here to get rid of this thing. Jacob had just stepped out of his front porch when they heard Campfire coming from over William's place. Dropping the phone book and running back inside, Jacob grabbed the 12-gauge pump shotgun and some shells and handed them to Kenny, who took a little time in loading it. Jacob and Kenny, now locked and loaded, walked together to Kenny's truck preparing to mount up a rescue for neighbor William. Simultaneously, both of them stopped in their tracks as an uneasy but familiar feeling crept over them, and Jacob's Rottweiler and 2 German Shepherds began to whimper and ran under the front porch to hide. Kenny, whose throat had suddenly gone dry as a bone, whispered to Jacob and said, "I have a really bad feeling about this." No sooner had the words escaped his lips, they heard a deafening scream erupt from the forest off to the right, and the creature exploded from the trees in front of them. Until now, neither man had been able to fully appreciate the colossal size and scope of the beast. But standing less than 30 feet away, they were almost overcome by the sheer magnitude of it. Jacob had seen it up close earlier from his truck while sitting down, and had guessed the height maybe 8 feet. But now, standing there looking up, he could tell that this fellow was 8.5 or 9 feet tall, and would tip the scales around 1,000 pounds. It had inhumanely long arms that bulged with thick, ropey muscle that were easily seen beneath its long, shaggy black hair, which covered it from head to toe. The chest was larger than a 55-gallon drum, and there is little doubt that it could pull the arms off an ape, and now it glared at them with malevolent intent. Jacob and Kenny both opened fire without hesitation. The creature screamed with rage as the bullets tore its massive body, knocking it to the ground, but not killing it or seriously injuring it. Jacob and Kenny watched speechless as it crawled into the tree line, struggling to its feet and limped away. Jacob ran back to the porch and grabbed the phone book and called the local game warden. Nearly 2 hours later, Gene Trauber, the local warden, showed up to take their statements and told them that he had been called out to answer numerous such reports in the area, but he wasn't sure what to make of all of the reports. "Guys," he said, "I don't know what to tell you. There is no such animal in this area, or in any area for that matter, that fits your description. I'm not saying I don't believe you. I just don't know what it is." Jacobs, whose face was reddened with anger, said, "Come here. Here's the blood from where we shot it, and here are the footprints." A look of complete confusion washed over Gene's face, and he asked if they would care to go with him as he tried to track it. Jacob and Kenny agreed, but they said that they weren't going anywhere without their guns. Gene stated that he planned to take his gun as well. All three men loaded their guns and set out following the deeply impressed tracks and droplets of blood that had fallen on withered leaves. They followed the trail for about a mile until arriving at a creek that was located deep in Jacob's woods, where the tracks that they were following were joined by others just like them. Some were smaller, but at least one set was larger. Deciding that the safest course of action would be to return home, they all went back to Jacob's. None of them relished the idea of staying out in the woods longer, since there was now apparently more than one creature, and the cloudy, overcast day made the forest seem even darker than it would normally be this time of day. Back at Jacob's, Gene informed them that there was nothing left that he could do but file it under an unknown animal sighting, which made both Kenny and Jacob anything but happy. Jacob and Kenny spent the next couple of days trying to warn their neighbors to use caution when they were out in the forest. Most of their friends just laughed at them and said that they'd probably seen a bear or something. No one believed them except William, who had seen it himself the same day they had. They had even taken a shot at it but missed. Jacob, William, and Kenny knew what they had seen, and they knew that it was still out there, and they didn't care who believed him and who didn't. Over the next few weeks, more and more neighbors began to take the stories a little bit more seriously, as family pets began to disappear and others were found brutally mangled. Other farms in the area began to find their cows and other livestock torn open with their throats ripped out. Just a few weeks after shooting the creature in his yard, Jacob's own Rottweiler was found dead with his throat torn out, hanging across a limb in the tree in his front yard. It almost seemed like a revenge killing. A few days later, one of William's new foals died the same way. The foal's mother had to be put to sleep because she had gone into shock over whatever she would witnessed in the barn when her foal was killed. Some people in the area still don't believe. They think the whole story was made up, but Jacob and Kenny know that there's still something out there in the forest. They still occasionally find tracks or a slaughtered cow or a goat. They still hear the blood-curdling screams off in the woods at night. They know that there is still something out there, watching and waiting, biding its time. Something cold and cunning and cruel. Something not human, with a taste for blood and revenge. Rabbits in the creek. I'm writing this because my family won't talk about it anymore. I'm the only one who can't seem to forget. I was raised on the outskirts of Preston, a small town in southern Idaho with a population of around 5,000. My more immediate community was isolated, dead-end dirt road called Bear Creek. Less than 20 families lived on Bear Creek. I didn't mind being so isolated. I grew up in the comfort of wide fields and close neighbors that only rural people know. We were a Mormon community, very church-centered, very community-centered. All the young girls, myself included, were part of the young women's group. All the boys were members of the local BoyScout troop, which doubled as a church group in our area. We had 4th of July parties at the local ballpark and swam in the nearby reservoir. It was a good, quiet community. My house, a 92-year-old farmhouse built by my great-great-grandfather, was situated on a small hill surrounded by a wide grass field on one side and a snaking dirt road on the other. Across the road was the creek bottoms. Southern Idaho is categorized in a desert climate, so not much grows in the irrigated fields besides sagebrush and burrs. The creek bottoms were the exception. The creek fed the growth of the thick tangle of pussy willow bushes. In the late fall, we'd used to go down there in the bottoms and pick the white, cottony pussy willow seeds to decorate the fences of our driveway. Being so isolated, it wasn't uncommon for animals to come down from the mountains.
We had a female moose who brought down her calf and lived in our other orchard every winter. And the occasional lion wasn't unheard of either. This summer when I turned 8, I remembered because it was the same year as my baptism. A smaller mountain lion was spotted several times in our area. We weren't worried. The big cats stayed away from the farms and usually moved on when the area didn't yield enough food. The same summer, my neighbor Peyton was working on his Eagle Scout project. He loved National Geographic and thought it would be pretty cool to try putting together a National Geographic's mission on our little creek bottoms. The young lion that happened to be in our area at the same time made him especially excited. He decided he wanted to try and get pictures of the lion and emailed the National Geographic team for advice. They recommended setting up an automatic camera that takes shots every couple of seconds in the area that the lion was known to visit. They also recommended setting up some kind of bait so the lion was more likely to come by. No one in the creek liked the idea of live bait or carrion, so we came up with a different kind of bait. We decided to set up an audio recording of a dying rabbit and play it on loop through a set of speakers hidden in the willows. I remembered when everyone was down in the bottoms testing the speakers, and I heard the noise for the first time. The sound of the dying rabbit is horrible. It's described as being almost identical to the sound of a screaming child. If you've never heard it yourself, there's plenty of recordings available online. It's worth a listen. The camera was set up. The speakers were set up. Everything was perfect. Peyton explained that he would allow the camera and the recording to play uninterrupted for a week, and then he would go check on it. This would give time for our scent to fade from the bottoms and encourage the lion to come closer. At first I was worried about the noise. It was a truly horrible noise, and our house was the closest to the sit-up point in the bottoms. My father assured me that the noise wouldn't reach as far as our house, and I was relieved when we arrived at home that night, and he was correct. The bottoms were far enough away that I couldn't hear anything. I remember Peyton the next day at church. He was fidgety and excited to check on the equipment, but he had to wait a week, which everyone kept reminding him. He couldn't risk going down there too early and scaring the lion away for good. That night I woke up to an awful noise. I sat ramrod straight up in bed with my eyes wide in the dark. Hands clutched so hard my palms bore the indents of my fingernails for hours after. I knew that noise. It was the recording of the rabbit. It sounded faint and far off, like it really could have been coming from the bottoms, but that was impossible. Because the recording had been going all night the previous day, and I hadn't heard a thing. I didn't sleep that night. I was too scared to get out of my bed and wake my parents. The recording played over and over again. I had the loop memorized. In the morning, I stumbled into the kitchen for breakfast. My mom and dad were sitting at the kitchen table. They too had dark rings under their eyes. I hadn't been the only one who'd heard it. Mom was convinced that the equipment must have been broken. She wanted to go down into the bottoms to check it out. Dad refused. He was a kind gentleman and didn't want to stir up any unnecessary drama. He was sure that there'd been a strong wind last night, and the wind carried the noise farther than its natural reach. He told us to listen. We did. He was right. We couldn't hear it now. We forgot about it and went about our daily goings. The next night it happened again. I stayed up in bed with my back to the wall. The screaming was even louder than before, but this time something was different. It was lower pitched than I remembered, and parts of the loop were slowed down, as if the recording were warped in places. At times, the loop did not loop naturally, and instead picked up at random places in the middle. My mom didn't mention anything at the breakfast table, but both her and my dad seemed tense. The third night, I mustered the courage to stand beside my bedroom window and look out into the yard. For a moment, I stood, rooted to the spot, my hands shaking no matter how hard I clenched them. The noise slid in through the cracks in the window. I watched the outline of the trees in the yard, perfectly still. Not even the slightest breeze stirred the branches. My mom announced that she'd be going to visit her sister in the town the next day and would probably spend the night there. She invited me to come along, but I was Daddy's little girl at heart and I chose to stay at the farm. I took Mom's place beside Dad in their bed that night, but even that didn't help. I don't think my dad was asleep either, for he was unnaturally still the whole night. We began to hear the noise during the day too. I was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk when it happened. My shoulders tensed and the hair on the back of my neck prickled. There was only one scream, a short, high-pitched one, and then the recording fell silent. It happened again several times, though, throughout the day. but never the whole loop, just clips from it. Later that evening, Peyton's dad came up the driveway on his four-wheeler. He said he was looking for their dog, a sweet yellow lab who had been missing since that morning. Dad said he was sorry and that he hadn't seen her. I stared at him, silently begging him to mention the recording. But he didn't. He was a quiet man after all. He didn't want to bring up any unnecessary drama. Mom stayed away the whole week. Dad and I didn't sleep. By Saturday, the screaming could be heard constantly, though it seemed to have deviated from this familiar loop entirely. I didn't recognize any of it. Sometimes the screams were thin and long, other times they were hardly more than growls. Once, while my dad had been heating up meatloaf for lunch, the noise rose in such a rancorous din that he dropped the plate and it shattered. I pressed my hand over my ears when I sat at the table, and I squeezed my eyes shut. But it didn't help. The noise forced its way through the cracks in my fingers, pinched my throat, and rattled in my ribcage. The din lasted for a whole minute, then fell silent. Dad was shaking. That was the last we heard of the noise that day. Peyton came by Saturday evening to ask permission to cross our road to collect the equipment. He was so excited. I watched him disappear into the creek bottoms with a sense of tired relief. After the equipment was gone, it would all stop. I couldn't wait to get a full night's sleep. Not a minute later, I spotted Peyton coming back up the creek. I was confused. It had taken us so much longer to set up the cameras and the speakers, so I'd only assumed it would take as long to collect them. My breath stilled when Peyton came closer. He didn't look right. His eyes were wide and his face pale. Something wet dribbled from his chin and onto his shirt. I later realized it was vomit. My dad caught him before he fell and demanded to know what had happened. Peyton couldn't speak. He just cried. We called his dad and I looked after Peyton as both my dad and his dad went into the bottoms. They were gone for a long time. When they returned, their faces were grim, and they smelled funny. I noticed red on my dad's hands. I asked what was wrong, but they brushed right past me and immediately called the police. Nobody would tell me what had happened. I sat on the couch as a blur of neighbors and police officers swirled around me. At one point, an officer placed something on the kitchen table and left. I looked into the kitchen curiously. It was the camera from the bottoms. I wish I hadn't looked. The camera was a little banged up. Tiny scratches and dents covered the plastic casing. When I lifted it, my hand stuck to the plastic. Something tacky and odorous covered the screen, but it turned on fine. The first set of photos were normal, just the pussy willow cast green and the glow of the night setting. As I continued to click through them, they quickly became strange. At one point the camera angle changed, as if the camera had been knocked from its post. Grass now obscured most of the frame. Flecks of red appeared on the lens and remained for the rest of the sets. One photo made me pause. There was a figure in this one, or half a figure, as most of the upper torso hadn't made it into the frame. I thought it could be human, but it didn't look like it should be standing upright. Its legs were twisted like an animal, and it seemed to be having difficulty supporting itself in an upright position. Beside the legs, a long, thin arm hung. Whatever it was, it must have been stooping over, for its fingertips hung below its correct knees. The next set was different. It was as if the camera had been picked up and was now being held. The first photo was of the bottoms at night. The next startled me. I had looked too closely before deciding what it was. A rabbit had been laid in the bushes, but its ears and most of its scalp had been peeled away. The next was of the same rabbit, but a thin dark hand was holding it up against the sky. Its limp body hung like something from a nightmare. In the following photos, more rabbits joined the one, each with their ears and scalps removed. Then a cat. Then more cats. Then a dog, the yellow lab. Then the lion. The following photo was of 7 rabbits, 3 cats, 1 dog, and the lion all laid out in a row facing the same way. Their arms and legs had been arranged as if they were marching, like some parade. All of their scalps had been removed, and tiny white glints of their skulls could be seen. The last photo was overly bright, like the photo had been taken too close with the flash on. An eye dominated the frame, but it was yellowed and crusted, and had a bar pupil like a horse. In the bottom corner of the edge, a mouth could be seen. No lips, just teeth, sharp and little, with little white gaps of red gums between them. I wish I hadn't looked. I heard my dad talking to the police outside. They said the speakers had malfunctioned. The recording had only played the first night.